Tonight we begin not with the grand coronation or the glittering ballrooms you might expect, but with something far more intimate and infinitely more pungent. The very personal, very aromatic world of an 18-year-old girl who just woke up to find herself ruling a quarter of humanity. Picture this. It's June 1837, London air thick enough to chew, reeking of coal smoke, horse manure, and human desperation all mixed together in a cocktail that would make a modern city dweller reach for industrial-strength air freshener. Somewhere in Kensington Palace, Victoria opens her eyes to news that will reshape the world for the next 64 years. We're about to walk through the birth of everything recognisable about our modern existence, where corsets met steam engines, where Sunday sermons battled Darwin's dangerous ideas, and where an empire that never saw sunset was built by people who thought showing an ankle was scandalous. Before we slip into these gaslit shadows together, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. There's something magical about sharing these midnight wanderings through history. Now dim those lights, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's ease into Victorian London's smoky embrace. That 18-year-old girl we left breathing London's toxic morning air, she had absolutely no business running an empire. Imagine inheriting a global corporation before you could legally drink. Except this corporation happened to control India, Australia, Canada, and enough scattered islands to make a pirate weep with envy. Victoria Alexandrina had spent her entire childhood being prepared for precisely nothing that mattered. The Kensington system, and yes, it was called that with the kind of pompous formality Victorians loved, was essentially helicopter parenting with royal consequences. Picture the most controlling parents you've ever met, then give them crowns and the power to influence international policy. Victoria couldn't walk downstairs without holding someone's hand. She couldn't have a conversation without a chaperone. She slept in her mother's bedroom until the day she became queen. It was emotional suffocation wrapped in silk and justified by protection. Every family has that one relative who meddles in everyone's business, convinced they know better than God himself about how lives should be lived. For Victoria, that was Uncle Leopold, King of Belgium, a man who treated European politics like his personal chess game. Leopold had been whispering in Victoria's ear since she could toddle, filling her head with ideas about duty, destiny, and the divine right of teenage girls to rule over millions of people they'd never met. The morning everything changed. June 20th, 1837, if you're keeping track. Victoria woke up in Kensington Palace to the sound of urgent knocking. Not the gentle tap-tap of a servant bringing morning tea, but the thunderous pounding of men who'd ridden through the night with news that would reshape the world. Her uncle, King William IV, had finally managed to die after months of hanging on just long enough to spite Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, who'd been circling the throne like a vulture in expensive jewellery. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain stood in her nightgown-clad presence. Imagine explaining that scene to modern protocol experts, and informed her she was now Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, Empress of India, and ruler of an empire where the sun quite literally never set. Her first recorded words as Queen, "I will be good." Not "I'm ready," or "let's conquer France," just "I will be good." It's either heartbreakingly humble or terrifyingly naive, depending on your perspective. Her first Privy Council meeting was political theatre at its most awkward. Picture a conference room filled with elderly men in elaborate costumes. Think Halloween party meets corporate board meeting. All staring at a teenager in a white dress who had to sit on a throne that was probably older than several of their great-grandfathers. Lord Melbourne, her first Prime Minister, later described her as having the dignity of a veteran diplomat trapped in the body of someone who should be worrying about piano lessons. These weren't just ceremonial old men playing dress-up either. These were the power brokers of the most influential nation on earth. The Duke of Wellington, yes, the one who defeated Napoleon, was there, probably wondering how a girl who couldn't choose her own breakfast was supposed to help him navigate European politics. The assembled lords watched her every gesture, every word, looking for signs of weakness, incompetence, or the kind of hysteria they assumed came standard with female anatomy. Victoria surprised them. Not by being brilliant, she wasn't, not yet, but by being completely, stubbornly determined to take every responsibility seriously. While her contemporaries were learning watercolours and French conversation, she was absorbing lessons in constitutional law, military strategy, and the delicate art of managing politicians who thought they were smarter than she was. Spoiler alert, most of them weren't. The constitutional chaos of those early years would make modern political drama look like a gentle disagreement over tea preferences. Nobody quite knew what a teenage queen could or should do. The British system had evolved over centuries to handle kings, preferably adult kings with military experience and strong opinions about foreign policy. A teenage girl who'd never been allowed to choose her own clothes. The Constitution offered no guidance beyond try not to start any wars accidentally. Melbourne became more than her prime minister. He became her political education, her father figure, and her introduction to the reality that ruling meant making decisions that would get people killed. He taught her that every signature on every document represented real human lives. Soldiers who would march, families who would be taxed, colonies that would be governed. It's one thing to sign papers in a palace. It's another to understand that your signature could determine whether Irish peasants lived or died during harvest failures. Then came Albert. Oh, Albert! The awkward royal romance that was equal parts political necessity and genuine human connection. Picture the most uncomfortable blind date in history. Except the future of European politics depends on whether you two hit it off. Victoria first met her future husband when she was 16 and he was 17. Both of them acutely aware that their entire purpose was to produce legitimate heirs while pretending this was a love story. Uncle Leopold had orchestrated the whole thing with the subtlety of a Victorian novel, which is to say, no subtlety whatsoever. He'd been pushing Albert as Victoria's future consort since both children were barely walking. Albert, a German prince with serious thoughts about art, science, and moral improvement, found himself thrust into the role of romantic interest for the future Queen of England. Imagine being told your career path is marry your cousin and help her rule an empire. The pressure was enough to give anyone performance anxiety. Their second meeting in 1839 was when the real magic happened, or at least when political necessity transformed into something resembling genuine affection. Victoria, now Queen, and slightly more confident, found herself actually attracted to this serious young man who discussed philosophy like other people discussed the weather. Albert discovered that Victoria, despite her royal circumstances, was funny, opinionated, and refreshingly direct about her feelings. But here's where the modern parallels get interesting. Think about young leaders today. Technology entrepreneurs running billion-dollar companies before they're old enough to rent a car. Social media influencers making decisions that affect millions of followers while still figuring out their own identities. Victoria faced similar pressures in a world without safety nets. Every mistake she made was analysed by newspapers, discussed in Parliament, and could potentially spark international incidents. The weight of it all was crushing. She had tantrums, spectacular royal tantrums that would make reality TV producers weep with joy. She fought with her mother, who couldn't accept that her daughter was now more powerful than she would ever be. She battled with politicians who treated her like a decorative figurehead, while expecting her to sign documents that would reshape global politics. She struggled with the loneliness of being the most important teenager in the world, while having virtually no friends her own age. Comment if you've ever felt completely unprepared for a responsibility that everyone assumed you could handle. Victoria's story resonates because that moment of I have no idea what I'm doing, but I guess I'll figure it out is fundamentally human. The difference was that her learning curve involved governing a quarter of humanity, while wearing a crown that weighed more than most people's dinner. The transformation from sheltered princess to competent monarch didn't happen overnight. It took years of mistakes, constitutional crises, and the gradual realization that being queen meant being simultaneously the most powerful and most constrained person in her kingdom. She could declare war, but only if Parliament agreed. She could choose ministers, but only from those who could command parliamentary support. She was the ultimate symbol of British power while being personally powerless, to make the kinds of changes she actually wanted to see. By 1839, Victoria had figured out the basic mechanics of being queen. Sign papers, look regal, try not to accidentally declare war on France. But there was one constitutional requirement that made her break out in a cold sweat. She needed to get married and produce heirs, preferably before her various relatives could scheme their way closer to the throne. The problem? According to royal protocol, she had to do the proposing. Victoria had to ask Albert to marry her. Imagine that first-date pressure amplified by the fact that your romantic rejection could cause an international diplomatic incident. The proposal scene, when it finally happened in October 1839, was so awkward it could have powered the steam engines they were just starting to build. Victoria, dressed in her best "please marry me" finery, had to summon Albert to a private audience and essentially say, "So, about that marriage alliance our relatives have been plotting since we were children." Albert, who'd spent months wondering if this royal courtship would actually materialize, had to pretend to be surprised while giving the answer that would determine his entire future. "It would make me too happy if you would consent to what I wish," Victoria managed to stammer out, which might be the most Victorian way ever recorded of asking someone to marry you. Albert, being a gentleman and also not completely stupid, accepted with what contemporary accounts describe as considerable emotion, which probably translates to relief that this incredibly awkward conversation was finally over. Their wedding on February 10th, 1840, created traditions that your great-great-grandmother probably followed without realizing she was copying Queen Victoria. The white wedding dress. Pure Victoria. Before her, brides wore their best dress in whatever colour they owned. Victoria chose white silk satin decorated with orange blossoms, creating a look so stunning that women across Britain immediately began demanding white wedding gowns. It was the world's first viral fashion moment, except instead of Instagram, the trend spread through ladies' magazines and whispered conversations over tea. The ceremony itself was spectacular theatre. Picture Westminster Abbey filled with every important person in Britain, all wearing enough jewels and ceremonial decorations to blind satellites. The Archbishop of Canterbury performed the service while trying not to trip over his elaborate robes. Military bands played outside while crowds of Londoners pressed against barriers, hoping to catch a glimpse of their young queen in her revolutionary white dress. But here's what the public didn't see. Albert struggling with what we might now call foreign husband syndrome in the 1840s. He was a German prince in a country that had spent centuries being suspicious of German influence. Parliament grudgingly granted him the title Prince Consort, but refused to make him King Consort. A deliberate snub that stung more than Albert ever publicly admitted. British newspapers criticised his accent, his serious demeanour, and his unfortunate tendency to have opinions about British politics. The British establishment treated Albert like that foreign exchange student who's clearly smarter than everyone else, but doesn't understand why people find his suggestions annoying. He arrived with plans to improve everything. British art, British morals, British efficiency, while the British aristocracy politely wished he would just smile, wave, and let them handle the actual governing. It was cultural clash wrapped in diplomatic courtesy, with Albert increasingly frustrated that his intelligence was being wasted on ceremonial ribbon cuttings. What saved their marriage from becoming a political disaster was that Victoria and Albert genuinely fell in love. Not the arranged marriage tolerance that most royal couples settled for, but actual messy, complicated romantic love. Victoria's diary entries from their early marriage read like a romance novel, written by someone who'd never heard of subtlety. She wrote about Albert's beautiful blue eyes and exquisite nose, with the kind of breathless enthusiasm that would make modern teenagers cringe. Albert, meanwhile, discovered that Victoria was not the spoiled princess he'd feared marrying, but a woman with strong opinions, a sharp wit, and an unexpected talent for political strategy. She was passionate about everything, her country, her duties, her feelings, while Albert was methodical, thoughtful, and determined to be worthy of the role history had thrust upon him. Their early marriage was two strong personalities learning to share power in a relationship where the power dynamics were unlike anything in human history. Victoria was queen, which made her theoretically more important than Albert, But Albert was male in an era when men expected to be the decision-makers in any marriage. They had to invent their own rules for how a queen and her prince consort could be partners without undermining either the monarchy or their marriage. The solution they developed was brilliant in its simplicity. Albert would handle the details while Victoria handled the public face of monarchy. Albert became her private secretary, her policy advisor, her speechwriter, and her political strategist. Victoria remained the visible symbol of royal authority, while Albert worked behind the scenes to actually run the machinery of modern monarchy. It was the first truly modern royal partnership, two people with complementary skills working together toward common goals. Together, they began building what we now recognise as the Victorian brand. Family values, moral authority, and the idea that the royal family should set an example for proper British behaviour. They popularised Christmas trees, turning a German tradition into a British institution. They made family photography fashionable, posing for portraits that showed them as loving parents rather than distant royal figures. They turned the monarchy into a symbol of domestic virtue rather than just political power. Their domestic life was surprisingly normal by royal standards. They argued about money. Albert thought Victoria was too generous with her relatives, and about parenting philosophy. Victoria wanted to spoil their children. Albert insisted on strict German discipline. They disagreed about social issues, with Victoria often more conservative than her supposedly foreign husband. Albert pushed for social reforms that would improve working conditions. Victoria worried about moving too fast and alienating the upper classes. The early 1840s were their honeymoon period in every sense. Albert designed improvements for Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace, creating private family spaces where they could actually relax together. Victoria learned to appreciate Albert's serious interests in art and science, while Albert discovered that Victoria's emotions and instincts often led to better political decisions than his careful analysis. They were creating the template for modern royal marriage: public partnership, private intimacy, and shared responsibility for representing national values. Their Christmas celebrations at Windsor became the model for middle-class family celebrations across Britain. Their emphasis on moral behaviour and family stability gave the monarchy a respectability it had lacked for generations. They were inventing new ways for a married couple to exercise constitutional monarchy, while dealing with the personal dynamics that made their relationship both stronger and more complicated than either had expected. While Victoria and Albert were creating domestic bliss in their palaces, most of their subjects were living in conditions that would make a modern health inspector faint dead away. Picture 2.5 million people crammed into a medieval city with plumbing that hadn't been updated since the Romans left. Now imagine all those people producing the normal human waste products, and you're beginning to understand why Victorian London was an assault on every sense simultaneously. The Thames, that mighty river that had carried Roman galleys and Viking longboats, had become London's primary sewer. Not metaphorically, literally. Every morning Londoners would empty their chamber pots into gutters that ran directly into the river, creating a toxic soup that somehow also served as their primary source of drinking water. It was a public health disaster so obvious that even Victorians, who thought night air caused tuberculosis, knew something was terribly wrong. Walking through London in the 1840s was like navigating an obstacle course designed by someone who hated human comfort. The streets were covered in a mixture of horse manure, human waste, rotting food scraps, and whatever industrial chemicals the nearest factory happened to be dumping that day. Rain didn't clean the streets. It turned the whole mess into a brown, stinking soup that splashed up to your knees with every step. The smell was legendary. Contemporary accounts describe London's aroma as a combination of rotting eggs, unwashed humanity, horse manure, coal smoke, and something mysteriously worse that nobody could quite identify. Visitors from the countryside would literally gag when stepping off trains. Foreign diplomats complained that London meetings had to be held with windows firmly shut, even in summer, because the outdoor air was worse than the stuffiest indoor atmosphere. But the smell was just the opening act. The real killer was cholera, a disease so terrifying that it could turn a healthy adult into a corpse in less than 24 hours. Cholera would strike London like clockwork, 1832, 1849, 1854, 1866, each outbreak killing thousands while doctors stood helplessly by, prescribing prayer and laudanum because they had no idea what they were fighting. Dr. Jon Snow, not the Game of Thrones character but a London physician who knew something about winter being coming in the form of waterborne disease, began playing medical detective during the 1854 cholera outbreak in Soho. While his colleagues were still convinced that cholera spread through bad air, Snow started mapping where people were dying and noticed they all clustered around specific water sources. Snow's investigation led him to a water pump on Broad Street that was drawing from a well contaminated by sewage from a nearby cesspit. When he convinced local officials to remove the pump handle, essentially the world's first public health intervention based on statistical analysis, the cholera outbreak began to subside. It was Sherlock Holmes-level detective work applied to public health, and it proved that London's water system was literally poisoning its own citizens. The government's response was typically Victorian. They appointed a committee to study the problem. Then they appointed another committee to study the first committee's findings. Meanwhile, people kept dying from preventable diseases while politicians debated whether government had the right to interfere with private property rights, even when private property was killing people. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer who might as well have worn a cape because he was about to save London single-handedly. Bazalgette was like Victorian Batman, except instead of fighting crime, he fought cholera, and instead of a secret cave, he had detailed mathematical calculations about sewage flow rates. The man was obsessed with the glamorous world of waste management, and thank God someone was. Bazalgette's plan was audaciously simple: build a completely new sewer system that would carry waste downstream from London far enough away that it couldn't contaminate the city's water supply. Simple to explain, incredibly complex to execute, especially when you're working with Victorian technology and need to dig tunnels under a city that's already built and inhabited by 250,000 people who can't exactly move out while you renovate. The construction project that followed was one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 19th century. Bazalgette and his crews dug 82 miles of main sewers and 100 miles of smaller sewers, creating an underground network that was more complex than the London street system above it. They had to work with picks and shovels, moving millions of tons of earth by hand and horse cart, all while avoiding the gas lines, water mains and building foundations that made London's underground a three-dimensional puzzle. The workers who built London's sewers were mostly Irish labourers who earned dangerous money for dangerous work. They worked in tunnels that could collapse without warning, in an atmosphere heavy with sewer gas that could kill you if it didn't knock you unconscious first. Cave-ins were common, flooding was routine, and the smell was so overwhelming that many workers could only manage a few hours underground before staggering back to the surface, gasping for air that merely smelled like horse manure and coal smoke. But gradually, mile by mile, tunnel by tunnel, they built the infrastructure that would make modern London possible. The main sewers were engineering marvels, brick-lined tunnels large enough to drive a carriage through, designed with gradients so precise that gravity alone would carry waste downstream at exactly the right speed. Too fast, and the tunnels would erode. Too slow, and solid waste would accumulate until the whole system backed up. Bazalgette didn't just solve the sewage problem. He over-engineered it with Victorian thoroughness. He designed the system to handle a population twice London's current size, which turned out to be brilliant planning since London kept growing. He incorporated storm drains that could handle the heaviest rainfall. He built pumping stations that looked like Gothic cathedrals because Victorians believed that even sewage infrastructure should be architecturally impressive. The transformation was miraculous. By the 1870s, cholera had virtually disappeared from London. The Thames began to clear up enough that fish started returning to central London waters for the first time in decades. The smell that had made London famous across Europe began to fade, replaced by the more manageable aromas of coal smoke and horse manure. Meanwhile, another revolution was lighting up London streets. Gaslighting, which sounds mundane until you realise it meant that for the first time in human history, cities could stay active after dark. Before gaslighting, London essentially went to sleep at sunset, Streets were dangerous, businesses closed, and nighttime was for sleeping, not for commerce or entertainment, or just walking around because you felt like it. The first gas streetlights transformed London into a different city after dark. Streets that had been too dangerous to navigate became bustling thoroughfares. Shops could stay open later, theatres could schedule evening performances, and people could actually socialise after sunset without risking their necks on unlit streets full of thieves and open sewers. Gaslighting also meant that London's class divisions became visible in new ways. Wealthy neighbourhoods blazed with light while working-class areas remained dark. The difference between a gaslit street and an unlit alley was the difference between civilization and medieval danger, and everyone could see exactly where they stood in London's social hierarchy just by looking at the streetlights. The combination of improved sanitation and gaslighting created the Victorian London we recognise from literature and movies, a city of gaslit streets and dramatic shadows, where people could walk at night without dying of cholera the next morning. It was still dirty, still crowded, still reeking of coal smoke, but it was no longer actively trying to kill its inhabitants through preventable disease. While Bazalgette was busy saving London from drowning in its own filth, something even more transformative was happening in the smoke-belching factories beyond the gaslit streets. Britain was becoming the workshop of the world, a steam-powered manufacturing machine so dominant that other nations could only watch in a mixture of awe and terror as British-made goods flooded global markets like an unstoppable industrial tsunami. Picture the sound first, because Victorian industry announced itself long before you could see it. The rhythmic hammering of steam-powered machinery, the screech of metal against metal, the constant hiss of pressurized steam escaping from boilers that looked like they might explode at any moment. Factory towns developed their own acoustic signature, a symphony of industrial noise that never stopped day or night, as shift workers kept the machines running in an endless cycle of production. The Great Exhibition of 1851 was Albert's attempt to showcase this industrial miracle to the world, and he chose a venue that was itself a technological impossibility. The Crystal Palace, a glass cathedral to human achievement that covered 19 acres and enclosed mature trees without harming a single branch. Joseph Paxton, the architect, had designed something that shouldn't have been able to exist. A building made almost entirely of glass and iron that was larger than most medieval cities and could be assembled like the world's most complex jigsaw puzzle. When the Crystal Palace opened in Hyde Park, it was like alien technology had suddenly appeared in Victorian London. The building was so transparent that birds kept flying into it, confusing themselves trying to reach the trees they could see but not understand were now indoors. Sunlight flooded through acres of glass, creating an indoor environment that shifted and changed throughout the day as shadows moved across the exhibits like slow-motion clock hands. Inside this crystal wonderland, Britain displayed the fruits of its industrial supremacy with the subtlety of a peacock having a nervous breakdown. Steam engines the size of small buildings demonstrated their power by running continuously throughout the exhibition. Textile machinery produced cloth at speeds that made traditional hand-weaving look like a quaint hobby. Agricultural equipment promised to revolutionize farming with the kind of mechanical precision that would have made medieval peasants think they were witnessing actual magic. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, recently acquired from India through methods that we'll discuss shortly, sat in a special case as the crown jewel of British imperial achievement. Visitors queued for hours just to stare at a rock that symbolized everything complex about Victorian success. Breathtaking beauty extracted through methods that probably wouldn't look good in a modern ethics review. Albert used the Great Exhibition to promote his vision of peaceful international competition, nations competing through industrial innovation rather than military conquest. It was a beautiful ideal that lasted exactly as long as it took other countries to realize that Britain's industrial head start was making them essentially economic colonies, dependent on British manufacturing while providing raw materials at prices Britain dictated. But here's where the Victorian story gets complicated in ways that make modern tech revolution debates look simple. Yes, British factories were producing goods at unprecedented scales, creating wealth that funded everything from sewage systems to royal palaces. But those same factories were also creating working conditions that were basically legal slavery with wages. Child labour wasn't an unfortunate side effect of industrialisation, it was a central feature. Children as young as 6 worked in textile mills because their small fingers could tie broken threads more quickly than adult hands. They crawled under moving machinery to collect cotton fibres, a job so dangerous that factory owners calculated child replacement costs into their annual budgets. The mortality rate in some factory towns was so high that entire generations grew up knowing they probably wouldn't live to see 40. Factory work meant starting before dawn and finishing after dark 6 days a week, in buildings where the air was so thick with cotton fibres or metal dust that breathing became a daily battle against your own lungs. Workers developed mill lung and black lung, and a dozen other industrial diseases that didn't exist before humans invented ways to fill the air with particles that could kill you slowly over decades. The railway mania of the 1840s exemplified everything extraordinary and terrible about Victorian progress. Britain built a rail network that connected every major city and most minor towns, creating a transportation system so efficient that it essentially eliminated distance as a barrier to commerce. You could ship goods from Manchester to London faster than previous generations could travel between neighbouring villages. But building that railway network required an army of labourers working in conditions that made medieval serfs look privileged. Navvies, navigation workers who dug the canals and railways, lived in temporary camps that moved with the construction, creating boom and bust communities that appeared and disappeared as the rails extended across the countryside. They blasted through mountains using gunpowder and prayer, built bridges across valleys that had never been spanned, and carved tunnels through landscape that fought back with cave-ins, floods and rockfalls that could bury entire work crews without warning. The human cost was staggering, but so was the achievement. By 1850, Britain had created a transportation network that let you travel from London to Edinburgh, a journey that had taken weeks by horse-drawn coach, in less than 12 hours. Time itself became standardised because railways needed coordinated schedules, creating railway time that eventually became the standardised time zones we still use today. Compare this to today's tech revolution, and the parallels are unsettling. Just as artificial intelligence and automation promise to revolutionise human productivity, while potentially displacing millions of workers, Victorian industrialisation created unprecedented wealth, while devastating traditional ways of life. Factory owners became incredibly rich, while factory workers lived in conditions that made pre-industrial poverty look almost pastoral. The Great Exhibition celebrated this paradox without acknowledging it. Visitors marvelled at steam-powered looms, while the people who operated those looms worked 14-hour shifts for wages that barely covered rent in overcrowded industrial housing. They admired precision-manufactured goods, while the workers who made those goods lost fingers to unguarded machinery with such regularity that industrial accident became a standard cause of death in factory towns. Albert's vision of peaceful competition through industrial excellence was noble in theory, but it ignored the reality that industrial supremacy was just another form of conquest. Britain didn't need to invade other countries when it could economically dominate them by producing goods so cheaply that local industries couldn't compete. It was economic imperialism with better public relations than military conquest, but the results for dominated economies were often similar. The Great Exhibition drew over 6 million visitors, roughly 1/4 of Britain's entire population at the time. They came from across Europe and beyond to witness what felt like a glimpse into humanity's technological future: steam power, precision manufacturing, global transportation networks, instantaneous communication via telegraph. The Great Exhibition showcased innovations that would define the next century of human development. But those visitors also witnessed something darker: the birth of industrial society with all its contradictions intact. Magnificent achievement built on human suffering, unprecedented prosperity existing alongside grinding poverty, technological miracles powered by working conditions that made medieval serfdom look humane by comparison, The profits from the Great Exhibition funded the establishment of what became the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, and the Natural History Museum. Institutions dedicated to celebrating human knowledge and achievement. It's fitting that these monuments to learning were built with money earned by displaying the very industrial processes that were simultaneously elevating and degrading human existence. Albert saw the Great Exhibition as proof that human ingenuity could solve any problem, that progress was inevitable, and that competition through innovation would replace competition through warfare. He was right about the power of human ingenuity, but wrong about progress being automatically beneficial, and tragically wrong about innovation replacing warfare. The same industrial capacity that produced beautiful textiles and efficient transportation would soon be producing more effective weapons and more efficient ways to kill people. The Crystal Palace itself became a symbol of Victorian contradictions. This miraculous building, assembled without a single nail, was eventually moved from Hyde Park to South London, where it served as a concert hall, exhibition space, and entertainment venue until it burned down in 1936. Even its destruction was spectacular. The largest fire London had seen since 1666, visible from miles away as Victorian engineering went up in flames that could be seen from 8 counties. Britain's position as workshop of the world was already being challenged by the time the Crystal Palace burned. Germany and the United States were building their own industrial capacity, learning from British innovations while avoiding some of British mistakes. The technological superiority that had seemed permanent in 1851 was proving to be just another historical moment, brilliant and brief and ultimately transitional. But for a few decades in the mid-19th century, Britain had achieved something unprecedented in human history, the ability to produce goods at a scale and efficiency that seemed to defy natural limits. Steam power had given humans control over energy sources beyond muscle and wind. Precision manufacturing had made identical products possible in quantities that would have amazed previous generations. Global transportation networks had connected markets across continents and oceans. The price of this achievement was becoming clear by the 1860s. Industrial cities choked with smoke, workers dying young from industrial diseases, traditional crafts destroyed by machine production, and social structures transformed so rapidly that nobody quite understood what kind of society they were building. But the achievement itself was undeniable. Humans had learned to harness the power of steam and steel to reshape the physical world according to their designs. That industrial wealth powering Britain's Crystal Palace exhibitions and London's magnificent sewers didn't appear from nowhere. It was extracted from an empire so vast that cartographers struggled to colour enough of the world map pink to represent British control. By the 1850s, British flags flew over territories containing nearly 400 million people, most of whom had never voted for British rule and were beginning to realise they never would be asked. The jewel in this imperial crown was India, a subcontinent of such staggering wealth and complexity that British administrators spent decades trying to understand what they had conquered. The East India Company, a private corporation with its own army, had gradually taken control of Indian territories through a combination of military conquest, political manipulation, and economic coercion that would make modern corporate takeovers look like polite negotiations. British rule in India was built on a foundation of cultural arrogance so profound that it takes your breath away. British administrators genuinely believed they were bringing civilization to a land that had produced advanced mathematics, sophisticated literature, and architectural marvels while Britain was still a collection of warring tribes. They imposed English legal systems on societies with legal traditions older than British civilization, then acted surprised when local populations resented having their own customs declared primitive and backwards. The economic relationship was pure extraction disguised as trade. India provided raw materials, cotton, indigo, opium, spices, at prices Britain dictated, then was forced to buy back finished goods manufactured in British factories at prices that guaranteed massive profits for British industry. It was a system so one-sided that it would make loan sharks blush, sustained by military force and justified by racial theories that classified Indians as naturally suited for subservience. But India was just the most valuable piece of an imperial puzzle that British foreign policy was assembling across the globe. The Opium Wars with China revealed the depths of British imperial morality with such clarity that even Victorian consciences were troubled. Britain was literally forcing China to accept British opium imports at gunpoint, creating millions of addicts to maintain favourable trade balances. It was state-sponsored drug dealing backed by military force, and when Chinese authorities tried to stop the opium trade, Britain responded with naval bombardments and military occupation. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, was fought over China's right to control what drugs entered Chinese territory. Britain won naturally because steam-powered warships with modern artillery tend to defeat sailing junks with medieval cannons. The Treaty of Nanking forced China to pay for the privilege of being invaded, cede Hong Kong to British control, and opened Chinese ports to British trade, including continued opium imports. The Second Opium War, 1856-1860, was even more brutal, ending with British and French forces marching into Beijing and systematically destroying the Old Summer Palace, one of China's greatest architectural treasures. They looted what they could carry and burned the rest, an act of cultural vandalism so comprehensive that the ruins still stand as a monument to imperial brutality. Lord Elgin, who ordered the destruction, wrote that it was necessary to teach the Chinese that the name of Europe is not to be trifled with. Meanwhile, the Crimean War, 1853-1856, was providing British audiences with their first real glimpse of modern warfare's reality, thanks to telegraph communications and newspaper correspondents who could report from battlefields in near real time. What they reported was horrifying. Not glorious cavalry charges and heroic victories, but administrative incompetence, supply failures, and soldiers dying from preventable diseases in numbers that made battle casualties look like rounding errors. Florence Nightingale emerged from Crimean hospitals as a national hero, but her real achievement was proving that more soldiers were dying from infected wounds and disease than from Russian bullets. Her statistical analysis demonstrated that basic sanitation could save more lives than military strategy, a revelation that eventually revolutionized military medicine but came too late for the thousands who died from preventable infections in Crimean field hospitals. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, which British sources called the Indian Mutiny, because calling it a rebellion would imply Indians had legitimate grievances, shattered British assumptions about imperial rule. The immediate trigger was British insensitivity about cartridges greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. But the underlying causes ran much deeper. Decades of cultural contempt, economic exploitation, and political domination had created resentments that exploded into violence. The British response to the 1857 uprising revealed the brutal reality beneath imperial rhetoric about bringing civilization to backward peoples. British forces executed rebels by strapping them to cannon mouths and firing, a method chosen specifically because it would prevent proper religious burial and terrorize survivors. Entire villages suspected of supporting rebels were burned. Mass hangings became public spectacles designed to demonstrate the consequences of defying British authority. British newspapers reported these reprisals with bloodthirsty enthusiasm. The Times of London called for a bill of costs against the people of India which will not be settled for a generation. Charles Dickens, the great humanitarian novelist, wrote that he wished he could exterminate the race upon whom the stain of the late cruelties rested. The veneer of civilized British values disappeared when imperial control was threatened. Yet even as British forces were crushing Indian resistance with calculated brutality, British public opinion was celebrating the empire as a force for global good. Maps showing British territories in pink-covered schoolroom walls, teaching children that their nation's greatness was measured by how much of the world's surface they controlled. Imperial heroes like General Gordon became household names. Their military adventures transformed into moral crusades bringing order to savage lands. The scramble for Africa revealed imperial competition at its most cynical. European powers literally drew lines on maps, dividing African territories between themselves with no regard for existing political structures, cultural boundaries, or the preferences of African populations. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 was a diplomatic dinner party where European diplomats carved up an entire continent like a Christmas turkey, each nation claiming territories they had barely explored and populations they had never consulted. British involvement in Africa combined missionary zeal with commercial calculation in ways that perfectly captured Victorian contradictions. David Livingstone genuinely believed that Christianity and commerce would end the slave trade and improve African lives. But British commercial interests in Africa quickly evolved into the same pattern of resource extraction and political domination that characterized British rule elsewhere. The economic benefits of empire flowed back to Britain in streams of wealth that funded everything from London's sewage system to the Crystal Palace exhibitions. Colonial profits financed British industrial development, paid for British infrastructure improvements, and supported the rising standard of living that made Victorian middle-class comfort possible. The price was paid by colonial populations who provided cheap raw materials and captive markets for British manufactured goods. But empire was also creating problems that British administrators were only beginning to understand. Educated colonial subjects who had studied in British universities were starting to use British political philosophy to argue against British rule. If all men were created equal and deserved representation in government, why were Indians and Africans excluded from governing themselves? British education was inadvertently creating the intellectual tools for anti-colonial resistance. Military costs were becoming unsustainable. Maintaining order across territories containing hundreds of millions of people required enormous military expenditures. Every colonial rebellion demanded expensive military responses. Garrison duty in tropical colonies killed British soldiers through disease faster than combat. The empire that generated wealth was also consuming resources at rates that raised questions about long-term sustainability. Colonial administrators were developing their own interests that sometimes conflicted with imperial policy. British officials who spent decades in India or Africa often understood local conditions better than politicians in London, leading to policy conflicts between imperial headquarters and colonial governments. The empire was becoming too complex for centralized control, too diverse for uniform policies, too large for effective administration. The human stories behind imperial statistics reveal the moral complexity that Victorian consciences were learning to ignore. British soldiers dying from tropical diseases while enforcing policies they didn't understand. Colonial subjects caught between traditional authorities and imperial administrators, belonging fully to neither world. British families enriched by colonial profits while remaining ignorant of how those profits were extracted. Individual British officials sometimes tried to govern according to their conscience, attempting to protect colonial subjects from the worst excesses of imperial exploitation, but the system itself was designed to extract maximum benefit for Britain, and conscientious administrators found themselves either compromising their principles or being replaced by more compliant officials. By the 1870s, the British Empire had achieved a scale and complexity unprecedented in human history. British naval supremacy protected trade routes connecting territories across every continent. British commercial networks moved raw materials from colonial territories to British factories, then shipped finished goods back to colonial markets. British administrative systems governed more human beings than any previous empire in history. But this achievement was creating the conditions for its own eventual destruction. Colonial subjects were learning British languages and British political ideas. Colonial economies were developing the infrastructure and educated populations that would eventually support independence movements. The very success of British imperial administration was making continued imperial control increasingly difficult to justify and expensive to maintain. The moral cost was becoming harder to ignore, even for Victorian consciences trained to rationalize imperial exploitation as a civilizing mission. Reports of colonial brutalities occasionally reached British newspapers. Parliamentary debates sometimes acknowledged the gap between imperial rhetoric and colonial reality. Religious leaders began questioning whether Christian principles were compatible with imperial practices. Victoria herself remained largely insulated from the brutal realities of imperial rule. receiving sanitised reports that emphasised British achievements while minimising colonial suffering. She proudly accepted the title Empress of India in 1876, genuinely believing that British rule was benefiting her Indian subjects, even as British policies were systematically impoverishing Indian populations and destroying traditional Indian industries. The empire that funded Victorian prosperity was simultaneously creating the educational, economic and political conditions that would eventually make that prosperity unsustainable. But in the 1870s and 1880s, those future contradictions remained largely invisible to British observers celebrating their nation's unprecedented global dominance. While British forces were consolidating imperial control across distant continents, a different kind of catastrophe was approaching much closer to home, one that would transform Victoria from a confident partner in constitutional monarchy into a grief-stricken widow whose personal tragedy would reshape how Britain understood royal authority and public mourning. Albert had been complaining of stomach pains and fatigue throughout the autumn of 1861, symptoms that royal physicians dismissed as overwork and nervous exhaustion. The Prince Consort had been driving himself relentlessly, managing everything from royal household administration to major government policy reviews. He was essentially serving as Victoria's Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, and Private Secretary simultaneously, a workload that would challenge anyone's constitution. But this wasn't simple exhaustion. Typhoid fever had entered the royal household with the stealth of an assassin, and in 1861 even royal physicians with access to the best medical knowledge available were essentially helpless against bacterial infections. They could diagnose typhoid by its characteristic symptoms: the rose-coloured rash, the sustained high fever, the progressive weakness, but they had no effective treatments beyond rest, prayer, and hoping the patient's constitution was strong enough to survive. The medical helplessness of the era is hard to comprehend from our perspective. These were the same years when British engineers were building railways across continents, and British administrators were governing hundreds of millions of colonial subjects. Yet British medicine couldn't save a 42-year-old man from a preventable disease. Doctors prescribed bizarre treatments, cold baths, hot baths, laudanum, champagne, beef tea, while Albert's condition steadily worsened and everyone pretended that royal status provided some protection against bacterial infections. Victoria watched her husband dying with the kind of helpless fury that comes when the world's most powerful woman discovers there are some things power cannot control. She had spent 21 years sharing every decision with Albert, relying on his judgment, trusting his analysis of complex political situations. Their partnership had been so complete that courtiers sometimes wondered who was actually ruling Britain, the Queen or her German Prince Consort. Albert's final weeks revealed the depth of their emotional and intellectual partnership. Even while fever consumed his strength, he continued trying to manage government business, dictating memoranda about American diplomatic relations and European political developments from his deathbed. Victoria sat beside him for hours, reading government dispatches aloud and taking his whispered responses to pass along to ministers who had no idea they were receiving policy guidance from a dying man. On December 14, 1861, Albert died at Windsor Castle with Victoria holding his hand. Her first reaction was a scream of anguish so profound that servants throughout the castle heard it and knew immediately that their world had fundamentally changed. "My life as a happy one is ended," she wrote in her diary that night. "The world is gone for me." It wasn't royal hyperbole. Victoria genuinely believed that her capacity for happiness had died with Albert. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Victoria, who had been an active, engaged monarch comfortable with public appearances and political discussions, essentially disappeared from public life. She retreated into mourning with an intensity that worried even Victorian society, which expected women to grieve extensively, but also expected them to eventually return to normal social functions. Victoria never returned to normal. She wore black for the rest of her life, not just black clothes, but black jewellery, black writing paper, black-edged handkerchiefs, even black flowers when possible. Windsor Castle, Buckingham Palace, and all the royal residences were transformed into shrines to Albert's memory. His rooms were maintained exactly as he had left them, with fresh clothes laid out daily and hot water brought for shaving, as if Albert might return at any moment. The widow of Windsor became Victoria's new identity, and she embraced it with the same thoroughness she had once brought to royal partnerships. She refused most public engagements, declined to open Parliament in person, and conducted government business from behind closed doors while wearing mourning dress that made her look like a professional grief counsellor rather than a reigning monarch. This personal transformation had profound political consequences. Victoria's withdrawal from public life created a constitutional crisis that nobody had anticipated. British monarchy depended on visible royal participation in ceremonies, state functions, and public events that demonstrated the continuity of constitutional government. When Victoria disappeared into permanent mourning, she left a gap in the constitutional system that politicians struggled to fill. Parliament couldn't simply replace the monarch. Victoria was still queen, still technically in charge of government functions that required royal approval, but a queen who refused to appear in public, who conducted business through written correspondence, who treated every government function as an unwelcome intrusion on her grief, created practical problems that challenged the entire system of constitutional monarchy. Victoria's grief was genuine and overwhelming, but it was also performative in ways that shaped how Victorian society understood public mourning. Her insistence on permanent black, her refusal to participate in celebratory events, her transformation of royal residences into memorial spaces, all of this became a template for proper grieving that influenced how middle-class Victorian families dealt with death and mourning. The cult of mourning that developed around Victoria's widowhood reflected deeper Victorian anxieties about death, memory, and social order. In a rapidly changing society where traditional authorities were being challenged by industrial development and democratic movements, Victoria's commitment to preserving Albert's memory represented a broader cultural desire to maintain connection with the past in the face of relentless modernization. Albert's influence on Victorian culture actually increased after his death, partly because Victoria was determined to complete projects he had initiated. The Albert Memorial, the Royal Albert Hall, the expansion of the South Kensington Museums, all these became monuments to Albert's vision for British cultural development, funded by Victoria's determination to honour his memory through permanent institutional achievements. But Albert's death also marked the end of the progressive, reform-minded approach to monarchy that he had championed. Albert had pushed Victoria towards social reform, educational improvement, and international cooperation through cultural exchange rather than military conquest. After his death, Victoria became more conservative, more resistant to change, more focused on preserving existing institutions than on reforming them. The psychological dimension of Victoria's grief reveals something profound about power and personal relationships. Victoria had shared royal authority with Albert in ways that were unprecedented in British history. She had genuinely consulted him on every major decision, treated him as an equal partner in constitutional monarchy, and relied on his judgment about complex political issues. His death didn't just leave her personally bereft. It left her politically isolated in ways she had never experienced. Victoria's diary entries from the months after Albert's death read like the private thoughts of someone whose identity had been fundamentally shattered. "I am anxious to repeat one thing, and that one is my firm resolve, my irrevocable decision, that his wishes, his plans, about everything, his views about everything are to be my law." She wrote this as if Albert's ghost could provide the guidance she had lost, as if preserving his opinions could somehow maintain their partnership beyond death. The transition from partnership to solitary rule forced Victoria to develop political skills she had never needed while Albert was alive. She had to learn to make final decisions without consultation, to trust her own judgment about complex issues, to manage relationships with prime ministers who could no longer rely on Albert as an intermediary. It was a brutal education in the loneliness of absolute authority. Government business continued, but it now flowed through a monarch whose grief coloured every political interaction. Ministers who had grown accustomed to dealing with Albert's rational analysis now faced Victoria's emotional responses to policy questions. Foreign diplomats who had relied on Albert's European connections now navigated Victoria's suspicion of any changes to policies Albert had supported. The personal had become political in ways that challenged everyone's understanding of how constitutional monarchy should function. Victoria's retreat into mourning wasn't just personal drama. It was a constitutional experiment that tested whether British government could function with a monarch who participated in ruling while remaining largely invisible to the public. By the mid-1860s, it was clear that Victoria's transformation from active monarch to grieving widow had permanently altered the nature of British royal authority. She would continue to rule for nearly 4 more decades, but never again as the engaged, publicly visible monarch she had been during her partnership with Albert. The widow of Windsor had become a new kind of constitutional monarch, powerful but reclusive, influential but invisible, shaping British politics from behind the black curtains of perpetual mourning. While Victoria was transforming royal residences into shrines of mourning, the vast majority of her subjects were dealing with very different domestic realities shaped by a class system so rigid and complex that it made royal protocol look straightforward by comparison. Victorian society had developed social hierarchies so precise that a person's position could be determined by everything from their accent to their breakfast choices, creating a domestic world where everyone knew exactly where they stood and exactly where they could never hope to reach. The great Victorian houses that employed armies of servants operated like small feudal kingdoms, with hierarchies so elaborate that senior servants looked down on junior servants with the same disdain that aristocrats reserved for the working classes. A butler in a wealthy household wielded more social authority than many middle-class professionals, commanding respect from subordinates and deference from tradespeople who understood that crossing the butler meant losing access to the household's business. Picture the morning routine in a wealthy London townhouse around 1870. The day begins at 5 a.m. when the scullery maid, the lowest form of human life in the servant hierarchy, drags herself from the servants' quarters in the basement to begin lighting fires throughout the house. She's perhaps 14 years old, paid $8 a year plus room and board, and her hands are already permanently stained black from handling coal and blacking stoves. By 5:30, the kitchen maid is preparing breakfast for the servants, who eat in strict order of precedence. The butler and housekeeper dine at the top of the servants' table, served by lower-ranking staff, while the scullery maid eats standing up if she's lucky enough to eat at all, before the family's breakfast preparations begin. It's a social system within a social system, where even the oppressed have someone to oppress. The housekeeper, a woman who commands the female staff with military precision, has been awake since 4:30 checking that yesterday's cleaning was completed to standards that would satisfy a medical examination. Every surface must be spotless. Every ornament must be exactly where the family expects to find it, and every sign of the 20-person workforce required to maintain upper-class comfort must be invisible by the time the family comes downstairs. Upstairs, the lady's maid is laying out clothes chosen according to rules so complex they require years of training to master. Morning dress for breakfast, walking dress if the lady plans to go out, different accessories depending on whether she's receiving visitors or making calls, and everything must be perfectly coordinated because a single fashion misstep could become social scandal fodder for weeks. The gentleman of the house requires his own domestic regiment, a valet to dress him, a bootblack to maintain his shoes to mirror brightness, and careful coordination with the kitchen to ensure his breakfast arrives at precisely the temperature and timing he prefers. His morning newspaper must be ironed flat. Reading wrinkled newsprint would be beneath his dignity, and his letters must be presented on a silver tray with precisely the right degree of ceremonial formality. Compare this elaborate domestic theatre to working-class reality, and the contrast becomes almost surreal. A working-class family in London's East End might occupy a single room that serves as bedroom, kitchen, living area, and workshop simultaneously. 8 people sleep in beds that fold against the walls during the day. Cooking happens on a single gas burner, if they're lucky enough to afford gas. Water comes from a shared tap in the courtyard, and the privy is shared with 3 other families. The smell of working-class London was as complex and overwhelming as the smell of industrial London we discussed earlier. Coal smoke from thousands of cheap fires mixed with cooking odours from overcrowded tenements, human waste from inadequate sanitation, and the particular aromatics of poverty. Unwashed bodies, damp clothes, rotting food scraps that couldn't be wasted no matter how spoiled they became. Working-class women performed domestic labour that would have killed the upper-class ladies they occasionally worked for as day servants. They rose before dawn to begin laundry that required hauling water, heating it over fires that had to be constantly maintained, and scrubbing clothes by hand using lye soap that stripped skin from their knuckles. They prepared meals from ingredients that were often partially spoiled because fresh food was a luxury. They maintained households while also working in factories, taking in piecework or performing the kind of manual labour that left them too exhausted to properly care for children who needed more attention than they could provide. Middle-class domestic life occupied a precarious position between these extremes, characterised by the desperate effort to maintain respectability while lacking the resources that made upper-class comfort possible. A middle-class family might employ 1 or 2 servants, usually a cook general and a housemaid, but the mistress of the house still performed significant domestic labour while pretending that her genteel status exempted her from manual work. The middle-class drawing room was a stage set designed to demonstrate respectability through material possessions, carefully arranged to suggest wealth without revealing its limitations. Piano lessons for daughters who had never become professional musicians, elaborate meals for visitors who were being impressed rather than fed, and clothes that were fashionable enough to maintain social standing, but not so expensive that they revealed the family's financial anxieties. The cult of domesticity that defined middle-class Victorian values placed women at the centre of moral authority, while confining them to domestic spaces where that authority had limited practical application. Women were supposedly naturally suited for creating moral atmospheres within homes, but they were legally prevented from owning property, pursuing professional careers, or participating in political decisions that affected their daily lives. A middle-class woman's day was structured around maintaining domestic perfection while appearing effortlessly genteel. She planned meals with a cook, supervised housework without appearing to perform manual labour herself, managed household finances while pretending that money matters were beneath feminine attention, and maintained social relationships that were essential to family status while appearing to value friendship over social climbing. The sounds of Victorian domestic life varied dramatically by class, but followed predictable patterns throughout society. Upper-class homes were characterised by the whispered efficiency of well-trained servants, moving through carpeted halls, the rustle of silk dresses, the clink of quality china at properly served meals. Working-class neighbourhoods echoed with the shouts of street vendors, crying children, arguments through thin walls, and the constant industrial noise that never stopped because factories operated around the clock. Victorian children's experiences were shaped by class distinctions from birth. Upper-class children lived in nurseries supervised by nannies, saw their parents during formal visiting hours, and received education designed to prepare them for lives of leisure and social leadership. Working-class children began contributing to family income as soon as they were physically capable, often starting factory work at ages that would now be considered criminal child abuse. Middle-class children occupied a complex position, too privileged for child labour but not wealthy enough for complete leisure. They attended school but also learned practical skills. Boys prepared for professional careers that would require serious work but offer social respectability. Girls learned domestic skills while being educated enough to marry men of similar social standing. The physical spaces of Victorian homes reflected and reinforced class distinctions in ways that made social hierarchies visible in architecture itself. Upper-class homes had separate servant staircases, ensuring that domestic workers remained invisible during their labour. Middle-class homes had front parlours for receiving visitors and back kitchens for actual work, maintaining the illusion that respectable families didn't need to perform manual labour. Housing quality declined so predictably by class that you could determine a family's income level just by counting rooms, examining window glass quality, or noticing whether the building had indoor plumbing. Working-class tenements packed multiple families into spaces designed for single households, creating living conditions that challenged basic human dignity while remaining perfectly legal under Victorian housing laws. The daily rhythm of Victorian domestic life was punctuated by meals that served as social rituals as much as nutritional necessity. Upper-class families ate elaborate multi-course dinners that required hours of preparation and formal service, with different wines for different courses and conversation topics that demonstrated cultural sophistication. Working-class families ate whatever they could afford when they could afford it, often standing up because furniture was a luxury they couldn't manage. Class distinctions shaped every aspect of domestic consumption: the quality of soap, the thread count of sheets, the cuts of meat, the varieties of tea, even the types of candles used for lighting. These weren't just practical differences, but social markers that announced family status to anyone who understood Victorian domestic codes. The result was a society where domestic life simultaneously connected and divided people. Everyone lived in families, ate meals, slept in beds, and dealt with the universal challenges of maintaining households, but the specific ways they performed these universal activities marked them as belonging to completely different social worlds that rarely intersected except through relationships of service and employment. Victorian domestic life was performance art on a national scale, where everyone played roles determined by birth, income, and social expectations. The tragedy was that these performances often prevented genuine human connection, creating isolation within the very families and communities that were supposed to provide belonging and support. But the system persisted because it offered everyone someone to look down on and something to aspire toward, maintaining social order through a combination of hope and humiliation that kept people focused on domestic concerns rather than political change. While Victorian families were performing their elaborate domestic rituals in drawing rooms across Britain, a quiet revolution was brewing in laboratories, libraries, and lecture halls that would shake the very foundations of everything those domestic performances were meant to preserve. The same society that had organized itself into rigid hierarchies based on God-given natural order was about to discover that nature itself might not be quite as orderly, or as divinely managed, as everyone had assumed. Charles Darwin had been sitting on the most dangerous idea in human history for over 20 years, knowing that publishing it would be like dropping an intellectual bomb into the centre of Victorian certainty. When On the Origin of Species finally appeared in 1859, it sold out on publication day. Not because Victorians were eager to embrace evolutionary theory, but because everyone understood they were witnessing the kind of paradigm shift that divides history into before and after. The central revelation was so simple it took your breath away. Humans weren't specially created by divine intervention, but had evolved from earlier species through natural processes that required no supernatural guidance. We shared common ancestors with apes, with fish, with every living thing on Earth. It was like discovering that your prestigious family genealogy actually traced back to pond scum. Technically accurate, but socially devastating. Picture the intellectual earthquake this created in a society where everyone knew their exact place in social hierarchies that were supposedly ordained by God. If humans had evolved from lower animals through random natural processes, what happened to the divine right of kings? What happened to the natural superiority of the upper classes? What happened to the moral authority of religious institutions that had based their teachings on humanity's special creation? The marketplace of ideas suddenly became a battleground where scientific evidence clashed with religious doctrine in debates that split families, divided congregations, and forced everyone to choose between faith and reason in ways that previous generations had never imagined necessary. Church leaders who had spent their careers explaining God's plan for human society were confronted with scientific theories suggesting that human society was just another accident of natural selection. But Darwin's dangerous idea was just one part of a scientific revolution that was transforming Victorian daily life in ways that seemed almost supernatural to people who remembered when candles were high technology. Electricity was beginning to replace gas lighting in wealthy homes, creating illumination so bright and steady that it literally extended the useful hours of each day. Photography was capturing permanent images with mechanical precision that made portrait painting look primitive by comparison. The telegraph had eliminated distance as a barrier to communication, allowing messages to travel from London to India faster than a horse could carry them across town. It was like the entire world had suddenly shrunk to the size of a neighbourhood, with information travelling at speeds that made previous generations' concept of time feel obsolete. Medical science was making discoveries that challenged traditional beliefs about disease, death, and human limitations. Joseph Lister's antiseptic surgery was proving that invisible germs caused infections, revolutionizing medical practice while contradicting folk beliefs about illness being caused by bad air, moral failings, or divine punishment. Anesthesia was making painless surgery possible, raising theological questions about whether pain was part of God's plan for human experience. Yet even as rational science was explaining natural phenomena with unprecedented precision, Victorian society was simultaneously experiencing the largest outbreak of supernatural belief in recorded history. Spiritualism, the belief that living people could communicate with the dead through mediums and seances, became so popular that middle-class drawing rooms were transformed into supernatural communication centres, where grieving families attempted to contact deceased relatives. The contradiction was staggering. The same society that was building steam engines and telegraph networks was also paying mediums to channel messages from dead Victorian relatives who apparently had nothing better to do in the afterlife than attend parlour seances. It was as if rational progress and irrational superstition were engaged in a cultural arms race, with each advance in scientific knowledge producing an equal and opposite reaction of supernatural speculation. Queen Victoria herself exemplified this contradiction. She employed the most advanced medical specialists available, while also consulting with John Brown, a Scottish servant who claimed to channel messages from Albert's spirit. The monarch who ruled an empire built on scientific and technological superiority was simultaneously seeking supernatural communication with her deceased husband. It perfectly captured the Victorian struggle to reconcile reason with emotion, progress with tradition, scientific discovery with spiritual need. The great intellectual debates of the 1860s and 1870s were public theatre, on a scale that made modern academic conferences look like intimate conversations. Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, engaged in legendary verbal combat with Bishop Samuel Wilberforce at the Oxford University Museum, defending evolutionary theory against religious orthodoxy in debates that drew standing-room-only crowds and newspaper coverage across Europe. These weren't polite academic discussions, but intellectual blood sports where fundamental questions about human nature and divine authority were fought out in public forums. When Huxley was asked whether he descended from apes on his grandfather's or grandmother's side, he reportedly replied that he would rather be descended from an ape than from a man who used his great gifts to obscure the truth. It was the kind of intellectual combat that could end careers and reshape entire fields of knowledge. The scientific boom was transforming not just ideas but the physical texture of Victorian life in ways that made the domestic routines we just explored seem almost medieval by comparison. Electric lighting was beginning to appear in wealthy homes, creating illumination so bright and steady that it revolutionized everything from reading habits to social gatherings. Gaslighting, which had seemed miraculous just decades earlier, suddenly looked primitive and dangerous by comparison. Photography was democratizing portraiture in ways that challenged traditional artistic hierarchies. Middle-class families could now afford permanent images of themselves, creating visual records of domestic life that had previously been available only to the wealthy who could commission painted portraits. Family photography became a new form of domestic performance, with elaborate pose scenes designed to demonstrate respectability and affection for posterity. The telephone, invented in 1876, promised to revolutionize human communication even more dramatically than the telegraph. Victorian commentators struggled to understand the social implications of technology that would allow people to speak to each other across vast distances. Would telephone conversations undermine the art of letter writing? Would instant voice communication destroy the social protocols that governed Victorian social interaction? Scientific advances in understanding nutrition, sanitation, and disease prevention were beginning to extend human lifespans in ways that challenged traditional assumptions about aging, death, and the natural order of family life. Children who might have died from preventable diseases in previous generations were surviving to adulthood, creating demographic changes that affected everything from family structure to economic planning. But every scientific advance also created new anxieties about human agency and divine purpose. If natural selection explained human development, what happened to moral responsibility? If germs caused disease, what happened to beliefs about illness being divine punishment for sin? If mechanical devices could reproduce human capabilities like memory, calculation, and communication, what remained uniquely human? Religious institutions responded to scientific challenges with strategies that range from complete rejection to creative accommodation. Some religious leaders declared science and faith to be inherently incompatible, demanding that believers choose between Darwin and God. Others attempted to reconcile evolutionary theory with Christian doctrine, arguing that natural selection could be God's method for creating human beings rather than evidence against divine involvement. The Catholic Church's response was particularly complex, with some Catholic scientists contributing to evolutionary research, while church officials maintained that human souls were still specially created by divine intervention. Protestant denominations split along lines that often reflected class and educational differences, with working-class congregations more likely to reject scientific theories that challenged traditional religious authority. Individual Victorians developed personal strategies for managing the conflict between scientific discovery and religious faith that often involved elaborate intellectual compartmentalization. They could accept scientific explanations for natural phenomena while maintaining traditional religious beliefs about moral behavior and spiritual meaning. It was like living in two different intellectual universes simultaneously, switching between them as circumstances required. The impact on education was revolutionary and controversial. Schools began teaching scientific theories that contradicted religious doctrines, creating generational conflicts between students who learned evolutionary biology and parents who believed in biblical creation stories. Universities became battlegrounds where traditional classical education competed with new scientific curricula for resources, student attention, and cultural authority. Women's access to scientific education became a particularly contentious issue, with debates about whether female minds were naturally suited for scientific reasoning becoming proxies for broader arguments about women's intellectual capabilities and social roles. The few women who managed to pursue scientific careers faced not just professional barriers, but fundamental questions about whether scientific knowledge was compatible with feminine nature. The psychological impact of scientific discovery was as profound as its practical applications. Victorians who had grown up believing they were the crown of divine creation suddenly had to adjust to being products of random natural processes. The cosmos that had seemed personally meaningful, with human beings at its center, was revealed to be vast, impersonal, and indifferent to human concerns. Yet this same scientific revolution was also creating unprecedented human capabilities that seemed to restore some sense of human significance. If humans weren't specially created, they were at least capable of understanding and manipulating natural forces in ways that approached divine power. Science might have dethroned humanity from its special place in creation, but it was simultaneously giving humans godlike abilities to reshape the physical world. The future implications of Victorian scientific discoveries were only beginning to become visible by the 1880s and 1890s. Electrical power would eventually transform every aspect of human life. Photography would evolve into cinema. The telegraph would become radio, then television, then the internet. Medical advances would extend human lifespans and eliminate diseases that had shaped human experience for millennia. But Victorians were living through these changes without understanding their ultimate implications. experiencing scientific revolution as a series of exciting but confusing innovations that promised better lives while challenging fundamental beliefs about human nature and social order. They were witnessing the birth of the modern scientific worldview, while still emotionally attached to traditional religious and social certainties that science was systematically undermining. The same scientific revolution that was challenging God's authority in Victorian society was also beginning to undermine another supposedly natural and divinely ordained hierarchy. The assumption that women were intellectually and morally suited only for domestic roles while men were naturally designed for public life, professional careers, and political leadership. If humans had evolved through natural selection rather than divine design, maybe the differences between men and women were also products of evolutionary adaptation rather than unchangeable divine commandments. If scientific education could unlock natural mysteries and technological innovations, maybe women's minds were also capable of scientific reasoning, mathematical calculation, and logical analysis. It was a dangerous line of thinking that would eventually transform everything Victorian society believed about gender, family, and social organisation. The angel in the house, the Victorian ideal of perfect femininity as domestic, self-sacrificing, and morally pure, was starting to look less like natural law and more like social convention that served male interests while limiting female potential. Women who had been educated enough to read Darwin, study scientific discoveries, and follow parliamentary debates were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about why their intelligence qualified them only for managing households, while men of obviously inferior intellectual capacity were making laws that governed women's lives. The first cracks in Victorian gender ideology appeared in education, where a few pioneering institutions began admitting women to courses of study previously reserved for men. Girton College, founded in 1869, and Newnham College, established in 1871, both at Cambridge University, created opportunities for women to receive university-level education while maintaining the fiction that they weren't quite ready for full academic equality with men. The women who attended these early colleges were intellectual pioneers undertaking journeys that no previous generation of women had been allowed to attempt. They studied mathematics, sciences, classical literature, and philosophy, while knowing that their academic achievements would never translate into professional opportunities equivalent to those available to their male classmates. They were proving women's intellectual capabilities while remaining legally and economically dependent on male relatives who controlled their property, income, and life choices. Picture the daily reality of being a female university student in the 1870s. You wake up in a dormitory supervised by rules that would make a medieval convent look permissive. You attend lectures where male professors address their remarks to male students while pretending you're invisible or treating your presence as a curious social experiment. You complete the same examinations as male students, but aren't allowed to receive official degrees for your academic work. The women who succeeded in these impossible circumstances were often brilliant misfits, who had somehow avoided the intensive social conditioning that taught most Victorian girls that intellectual ambition was unfeminine and therefore morally suspicious. They came from families wealthy enough to afford university education and progressive enough to believe that daughters deserved educational opportunities, even if those opportunities would never lead to conventional careers. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson became England's first licensed female physician by finding legal loopholes in medical licensing requirements that had been written assuming only men would apply. She completed medical training while facing hostility from male classmates, exclusion from clinical opportunities, and professional ostracism from medical societies that refused to admit women. When she finally established her medical practice, she had to prove her competence daily to patients who assumed that female doctors were inherently less capable than male physicians. The legal reforms of the 1870s and 1880s began addressing some of the most egregious legal disabilities that treated married women as property rather than people. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 gradually allowed women to control their own earnings and inherit property without automatic transfer to their husbands, revolutionary changes that challenged the fundamental legal structure of Victorian marriage. These legal reforms were responses to increasingly vocal women's rights campaigns that were using Victorian moral arguments against Victorian gender restrictions. If women were naturally more moral than men, reformers argued, shouldn't women have political voices to influence public morality? If women were responsible for educating children and maintaining social values, shouldn't they have professional training that would make them more effective teachers and social workers? The new woman ideal that emerged in the 1880s and 1890s represented a direct challenge to Angel in the house domesticity, though it was still constrained by Victorian assumptions about feminine nature and proper social behaviour. The new woman might pursue higher education, professional careers and political interests, but she was expected to maintain moral purity, domestic skills, and eventual commitment to marriage and motherhood. New women were often portrayed in literature and journalism as either heroic pioneers or dangerous social threats, depending on the author's perspective on gender equality. Conservative critics worried that educated women would become unmarriageable, and that professional careers would undermine women's natural maternal instincts. Progressive supporters argued that educated women would become better wives and mothers, while also contributing to social progress through their professional work. The tension between individual achievement and social conformity was particularly intense for women who were trying to balance personal ambitions with family expectations and social pressures. A woman who pursued medical training or legal education was making choices that might exclude her from traditional marriage and motherhood, since most men were reluctant to marry women whose education exceeded their own. Professional barriers were falling slowly and selectively, usually in fields that could be portrayed as extensions of women's natural domestic and nurturing roles. Teaching, nursing, and social work became acceptable professional options for women because they involved caring for others in ways that seemed consistent with feminine nature. Medicine became accessible to women who specialized in treating women and children, preserving male doctors' authority over male patients while acknowledging that female patients might prefer female physicians. The suffrage movement was gaining momentum by connecting women's moral authority in domestic spheres to political arguments for voting rights. If women were responsible for raising moral citizens, suffrage advocates argued, they needed political voices to influence laws affecting education, child welfare, and social morality. The vote wasn't about challenging traditional gender roles, but about extending women's moral influence from private homes to public policy. Frances Willard, leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, exemplified this approach by arguing that women needed political power to protect homes and families from the social evils that male politicians were failing to address. Alcohol abuse, political corruption, and social vice were destroying family life, and women's votes were necessary to elect officials who would prioritize moral reform over business interests. But even these moderate arguments for women's political participation faced fierce resistance from men and women who believed that political involvement would corrupt feminine nature and undermine the moral authority that made women valuable as wives and mothers. Political activity was inherently controversial, competitive, and morally corrupting, critics argued, and women who engaged in political campaigns would lose the moral purity that was their greatest contribution to social stability. The paradox of Queen Victoria's reign added complexity to all discussions of women's capabilities and appropriate roles. Victoria was clearly demonstrating that women could exercise political authority, make complex policy decisions, and command respect from male politicians and foreign leaders. Yet Victoria herself opposed women's suffrage and regularly expressed conservative views about women's proper domestic roles. Victoria's example proved that women could handle political responsibility, while her stated opinions reinforced traditional gender ideology. She was simultaneously the most powerful woman in the world and a vocal supporter of limiting other women's opportunities for public authority. It was as if she considered her own political success an exception that proved the general rule about women's unsuitability for public life. The generation of women coming of age in the 1880s and 1890s faced choices that their mothers could never have imagined. University education or conventional marriage preparation, professional careers or domestic responsibilities, political activism or social conformity. These weren't easy choices, and they often came with personal costs that made pioneering women's achievements seem hollow to observers who valued family relationships over individual accomplishments. Individual success stories were inspiring, but also highlighted the barriers that prevented most women from pursuing similar opportunities. For every Elizabeth Garrett Anderson who became a successful physician, there were hundreds of women with similar intellectual capabilities who never had access to medical education. For every woman who attended university, there were thousands whose families considered female education a waste of resources that should be invested in sons' careers. The social resistance to women's advancement was often most intense from other women who had internalized traditional gender ideology and viewed new women as threats to social stability and feminine respectability. Women who devoted their lives to achieving perfection within domestic roles felt personally criticized by other women who rejected domesticity as inadequate for female fulfillment. Economic changes were creating new opportunities for women's employment while maintaining wage discrimination that kept women economically dependent on male family members. Department stores, telephone exchanges, and office work offered respectable employment for middle-class women who needed income but couldn't afford university education or professional training. These jobs provided economic independence while maintaining clear distinctions between women's work and men's careers. The typewriter became a symbol of women's changing economic role, creating employment opportunities that were simultaneously liberating and limiting. Women could earn wages through office work that was respectable and intellectually engaging, but secretarial positions were explicitly designed to support male professionals rather than provide independent career advancement for women workers. By the 1890s, the new woman had become a recognizable social type. Educated, professionally ambitious, politically aware, and at least partially economically independent. But she was also a transitional figure, challenging traditional gender roles without completely rejecting Victorian assumptions about feminine nature and social responsibility. The changes were real but incomplete, revolutionary in their implications but conservative in their immediate impact. Women were gaining access to education, professional opportunities, and legal rights that previous generations could never have imagined. But they were doing so within social structures that still assumed male authority and female dependence as natural and desirable. The angel in the house was fighting back, but she was doing so while wearing Victorian corsets and maintaining Victorian respectability, creating social change that challenged gender inequality without rejecting the fundamental Victorian belief that men and women were naturally suited for different social roles. It was progress disguised as tradition, revolution wrapped in respectability, and change that preserved as much as it transformed. While new women were challenging traditional gender roles in university lecture halls and professional offices, a very different kind of female rebellion was taking place in the gaslit streets and shadowy alleyways of Victorian London. The same society that was debating whether women were intellectually capable of higher education was simultaneously creating economic conditions that forced thousands of women into prostitution, opium dependency, and other survival strategies that Victorian morality officially condemned but practically required. The Great Victorian Paradox wasn't just about gender equality. It was about the gap between public virtue and private reality that made Victorian society function like a massive exercise in collective self-deception. The same middle-class men who supported moral purity campaigns and attended temperance meetings were also the primary customers for London's thriving sex trade, opium dens, and gambling houses that operated in plain sight while remaining officially invisible. Picture London after dark in the 1870s, when gaslighting created pools of yellow illumination separated by stretches of darkness that might as well have been different countries with different moral codes. Respectable streets where middle-class families maintained their domestic performances were located just blocks away from districts where different rules applied and different economies operated according to market forces that polite society refused to acknowledge. The West End theatres and music halls that provided respectable entertainment for Victorian families were surrounded by a constellation of less respectable establishments that served the same customers with different forms of pleasure and escape. A gentleman could attend a morally improving lecture on social reform in the early evening, then spend the later hours in establishments where social reform was the last thing anyone wanted to discuss. Prostitution in Victorian London wasn't a marginal criminal enterprise but a major industry that employed tens of thousands of women and generated enormous revenues that flowed through every level of society. Police estimates suggested that London had over 80,000 prostitutes by the 1880s, serving a customer base that included everyone from working-class men spending their weekly wages to aristocrats maintaining expensive mistresses in discreet private residences. The economics of Victorian prostitution revealed the brutal mathematics of women's limited economic opportunities in industrial society. A working-class woman employed in a textile factory might earn 10 to 15 shillings per week for 60 hours of dangerous labour, while the same woman could earn that amount in a single evening through prostitution. It wasn't moral corruption that drove women into sex work. It was economic rationality in a society that offered women few legal ways to earn survival wages. The geography of London's sex trade was as carefully organised as any legitimate business district. Different areas specialised in different markets. Expensive courtesans operated in fashionable West End neighbourhoods. Middle-market prostitutes worked the theatres and entertainment districts, while cheaper establishments served working-class customers in industrial areas where moral respectability was a luxury nobody could afford. Haymarket became notorious as London's primary sex market, where women from across the economic spectrum converged each evening to serve male customers from all social classes. The area around Piccadilly Circus transformed after dark into an open-air marketplace where sex, drugs, alcohol and entertainment were available to anyone with money and minimal discretion. But Victorian society's relationship with prostitution was far more complex than simple moral condemnation. The same religious leaders who preached against sexual immorality also argued that prostitution served an essential social function by providing sexual outlets for unmarried men while protecting the virtue of respectable women who might otherwise be targets of male sexual aggression. The social evil, as prostitution was euphemistically called, was simultaneously condemned as moral corruption and accepted as necessary social infrastructure. Reformers established rescue missions to save fallen women, while politicians and police officials maintained the legal and economic conditions that made prostitution profitable and essentially inevitable. Opium dens provided another form of escape from industrial society's pressures, offering temporary relief from physical pain, emotional despair, and social alienation through chemical means that were legal, readily available, and socially acceptable when used for medical purposes. The same opium that British merchants were forcing on Chinese consumers was also providing relief for British workers whose lives had become unbearable through industrial accidents, chronic diseases, and psychological stress. London's opium dens operated in a legal grey area where recreational drug use was technically illegal, but practically tolerated as long as it remained confined to working-class districts, where middle-class reformers rarely ventured. These establishments served a diverse clientele that included Chinese immigrants, British workers, and middle-class adventurers seeking exotic experiences in London's underground economy. The atmosphere in opium dens was described by contemporary observers as otherworldly. Dimly lit rooms filled with sweet-smelling smoke, customers lying on cots or cushions in various stages of narcotic stupor, and an overall sense of escape from the harsh realities of Victorian industrial society. It was like stepping into a different world where time moved differently and social conventions didn't apply. Gin palaces represented the working class's more accessible form of chemical escape, providing alcohol consumption in settings that were simultaneously more respectable and more dangerous than opium dens. These establishments were designed to attract customers through spectacular interiors that provided luxury experiences for people whose daily lives contained very little luxury. The typical gin palace featured mirrors, crystal chandeliers, elaborate decorations, and serving areas that were designed to make working-class customers feel temporarily wealthy and important. Women served as bartenders, creating social spaces where gender interactions followed different rules than those that governed respectable society. But gin palaces also created social problems that reformers used to justify temperance campaigns and moral purity movements. Alcohol abuse destroyed working-class families, consumed wages that were needed for food and housing, and created cycles of poverty and dysfunction that affected entire communities. The temperance movement represented Victorian moral reform at its most ambitious and contradictory. Middle-class reformers, many of them women who were finding political voices through moral crusades, attempted to solve working-class social problems through legislation that would eliminate access to alcohol and other forms of chemical escape. Frances Willard's Woman's Christian Temperance Union combined women's rights advocacy with moral reform in ways that challenged traditional gender roles while reinforcing class-based assumptions about social problems. Women were claiming political authority to protect families and communities from social evils, but they were doing so by targeting working-class behaviours rather than the economic conditions that made those behaviours attractive survival strategies. Reform campaigns created strange alliances between feminist activists seeking political influence and conservative religious leaders seeking moral authority, united by shared beliefs that government intervention could solve social problems through moral legislation. It was progressive politics wrapped in conservative morality, challenging existing power structures while reinforcing others. The Jack the Ripper murders of 1888 brought Victorian London's underground economy into harsh public focus in ways that revealed both the reality of women's economic desperation and middle-class society's fascination with violence against women they simultaneously condemned and consumed as customers. The 5 canonical Ripper victims were all prostitutes working in Whitechapel, London's most impoverished district, where women's economic options were so limited that street prostitution seemed preferable to factory work, domestic service, or slow starvation. Their deaths became international news not because Victorian society valued prostitutes' lives, but because the murders were so spectacular and mysterious that they provided perfect material for newspaper sensationalism. The media coverage of the Ripper murders revealed Victorian attitudes toward women, class, and moral responsibility in ways that were both progressive and deeply disturbing. Newspapers expressed sympathy for the murdered women while describing their lives in language that suggested their deaths were inevitable consequences of immoral choices rather than results of social conditions that limited women's economic opportunities. The police investigation was hampered by assumptions that prostitutes were unreliable witnesses whose testimony couldn't be trusted in criminal proceedings. The same women who were serving middle-class male customers were considered too morally corrupt to provide credible information about crimes committed against them. But the Ripper case also generated public discussions about women's safety, economic vulnerability, and social responsibility that challenged Victorian assumptions about individual moral responsibility for social problems. Some commentators began arguing that society bore responsibility for creating conditions that forced women into dangerous economic situations. The contrast between public moral rhetoric and private behaviour became impossible to ignore when the murders highlighted the reality that respectable Victorian gentlemen were the primary customers for prostitution services. The same society that condemned fallen women was also creating the economic demand that made prostitution profitable. Music halls provided another venue where Victorian moral contradictions played out through entertainment that was simultaneously respectable and subversive. These establishments offered family-friendly performances that included songs, comedy, and variety acts while also serving as social spaces where different classes mingled and different behavioural standards applied. The content of music hall entertainment often included sexual innuendo, social satire, and political commentary that would have been unacceptable in more respectable venues. Performers could mock social conventions, challenge authority figures, and express working-class perspectives on economic inequality through comedy and song in ways that direct political protest might not have been tolerated. Female music hall performers occupied complex social positions as public entertainers who were simultaneously celebrated and morally suspect. They commanded audiences, earned independent incomes, and achieved a form of celebrity that was unusual for working-class women, but they also faced assumptions that theatrical work was inherently connected to prostitution and moral corruption. The audience experience in music halls involved participation, interaction, and social mixing that challenged the passive, hierarchical social relationships that characterized more respectable entertainment venues. Working-class customers could express approval or disapproval directly, creating theatrical experiences that were more democratic and less controlled than opera houses or legitimate theatres. Religious revival movements attempted to provide alternative forms of community and escape that would compete with commercial vice industries. Evangelical campaigns offered spiritual experiences, social networks, and moral frameworks that could provide meaning and purpose for people whose lives had been disrupted by industrial social change. But religious movements also created their own forms of social control and moral policing that sometimes rivaled commercial vice in their potential for exploitation and abuse. Charismatic religious leaders could wield enormous influence over followers seeking spiritual guidance and community belonging. The Salvation Army represented an innovative approach to social reform that combined religious evangelism with practical assistance for people dealing with poverty, addiction, and social alienation. Rather than simply condemning vice, the Salvation Army attempted to create alternative social institutions that could provide community, purpose, and survival resources. William Booth's In Darkest England and the Way Out offered a comprehensive analysis of urban poverty and social dysfunction that connected individual moral problems to broader economic and social conditions. It was social gospel activism that challenged both individual behaviour and structural inequality. The reform movements of the 1880s and 1890s were beginning to recognise that moral exhortation alone couldn't solve social problems that were rooted in economic inequality, limited opportunities, and social conditions that made vice attractive as survival strategy. But Victorian society still lacked the political frameworks necessary to address structural problems through systematic social reform. The lived reality for most Victorians involved navigating between public respectability and private survival in ways that required constant moral compromise and social performance. People learned to maintain different behavioural standards for different contexts, developing sophisticated abilities to compartmentalise their lives according to situational requirements. The result was a society where almost everyone was simultaneously upholding moral standards and violating them, creating collective hypocrisy that was both socially functional and personally exhausting. Victorian morality provided social cohesion and behavioural guidelines, while also generating enormous psychological stress for people who couldn't possibly live up to its idealised standards. While London's moral contradictions played out in gaslit streets and underground economies, a different kind of moral crisis was unfolding just across the Irish Sea, where British imperial authority was creating human suffering on a scale that made urban vice look like a minor social inconvenience by comparison. The Irish question wasn't just about political autonomy or cultural identity. It was about whether the British Empire could maintain moral legitimacy while systematically impoverishing and oppressing the closest of its colonial subjects. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 had revealed the brutal mathematics of imperial economics with a clarity that haunted British consciences for generations afterward. When potato blight destroyed Ireland's primary food crop, British authorities faced a choice between providing massive relief aid and maintaining the free market economic principles that made imperial exploitation profitable. They chose ideology over human life, and the result was demographic catastrophe that killed over 1 million Irish people, while another million fled the country in conditions that resembled refugee crises more than voluntary emigration. The famine wasn't a natural disaster. It was a policy disaster that demonstrated how imperial administration could transform agricultural failure into genocidal neglect. Ireland continued exporting food to Britain throughout the famine years, while Irish people starved, an economic relationship so perverse that it challenged every Victorian assumption about progress, civilization, and moral government. Picture the human reality behind those statistics. Entire villages disappearing as residents died or fled, children with swollen bellies and hollow eyes begging along roads that led nowhere safe, families making decisions about which members might survive emigration voyages that killed passengers at rates that earned ships the nickname coffin ships. British officials rationalised their minimal relief efforts through economic theories that treated famine as divine punishment for Irish moral failings and overpopulation. Charles Trevelyan, who managed British famine policy, wrote that the real evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the people. It was victim blaming elevated to the level of imperial policy, justified through racial theories that portrayed Irish suffering as evidence of Irish inferiority. The demographic impact permanently altered Irish society in ways that British authorities hadn't anticipated. The 1 million people who fled Ireland during and after the famine created Irish-American communities that maintained cultural connections to Ireland, while developing economic and political resources that could support Irish independence movements. British policy had inadvertently created a global Irish diaspora with both emotional investment in Irish freedom and practical capabilities to fund resistance to British rule. Irish America became a parallel political system that provided resources, leadership, and international pressure that Irish domestic politics couldn't generate independently. Irish American organizations could raise funds for Irish political campaigns, lobby American politicians to support Irish independence, and create diplomatic pressure that complicated British international relations. The Fenian movement of the 1860s demonstrated how Irish American resources could support military action against British authority in ways that purely domestic Irish resistance couldn't achieve. Fenian raids across the Canadian border were essentially Irish-American military operations designed to pressure British policy toward Ireland by threatening British interests in North America. But the Fenian campaigns also revealed the limitations of diaspora nationalism. Irish Americans who had achieved economic success and political integration in American society often had romanticized views of Irish conditions that didn't match the complex realities facing Irish political leaders who had to operate within British legal and political constraints. Home Rule became the political compromise that attempted to address Irish demands for self-government while maintaining British imperial unity. The idea was simultaneously radical and conservative. Radical because it acknowledged Irish rights to political autonomy, conservative because it preserved ultimate British authority over Irish affairs. Charles Stewart Parnell emerged as the political genius who could navigate between Irish nationalist expectations and British parliamentary realities, building an Irish parliamentary party that could influence British politics while advancing Irish interests. Parnell understood that Irish independence would have to be won through British political processes rather than through military rebellion that British forces could easily suppress. The parliamentary battles over Home Rule tore British politics apart in ways that revealed fundamental contradictions about imperial authority and democratic representation. If Ireland deserved self-government because Irish people were capable of democratic participation, why didn't India, Egypt, and other colonial territories deserve similar political autonomy? If Ireland didn't deserve self-government because imperial unity required centralised British control, why was Ireland different from Scotland or Wales? Liberal politicians who supported Irish Home Rule found themselves defending principles that could justify independence movements throughout the British Empire. Conservative politicians who opposed Irish Home Rule found themselves arguing that democratic representation was conditional on ethnic identity and geographic location in ways that challenged fundamental Victorian beliefs about political equality and moral progress. The debates revealed British attitudes toward Irish identity that combined cultural prejudice with political calculation in ways that made consistent imperial policy impossible. British politicians who considered themselves progressive on social issues expressed views about Irish character and capabilities that wouldn't look out of place in discussions about colonial subjects in Africa or Asia. Yet Ireland's position within the United Kingdom also created legal and political complications that didn't exist in other imperial territories. Irish members of Parliament could vote on British domestic issues while British members voted on Irish affairs, creating constitutional relationships that satisfied nobody and generated resentments on all sides. The Land War of the 1880s brought Irish grievances about economic exploitation into direct conflict with British property rights in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about legal authority and economic justice. Irish tenant farmers were demanding rent reductions and security of tenure, while British landlords were asserting traditional property rights that had been guaranteed by centuries of legal precedent. The Irish Land League organised resistance to rent payments and evictions through strategies that combined legal protest with economic pressure and social ostracism. Landlords who evicted tenants found themselves isolated from local communities, unable to find workers, and facing organised campaigns that made property ownership economically unsustainable. Captain Charles Boycott became the unwilling namesake for economic protest strategies. When Irish tenants refused to work his land, local businesses refused to serve him, and even the local postman refused to deliver his mail. Boycotting was economic warfare waged through social cooperation, demonstrating Irish political organisation that British authorities found difficult to counter through traditional legal measures. The government's response combined legal reform with military force in ways that acknowledged Irish grievances while maintaining British authority. Land reform legislation provided tenant protections and rent reductions, while Crimes Acts expanded police powers and suspended normal legal rights in districts where resistance was organised. But British policy was simultaneously creating and suppressing the conditions that made Irish resistance attractive and effective. Economic reforms that improved Irish living conditions also created resources and education that supported more sophisticated political organisation. Legal protections that secured Irish rights also created precedents that could justify broader demands for political autonomy. Cultural suppression attempts backfired by creating nationalist symbols and grievances that united Irish opposition to British rule. Efforts to eliminate Irish language, music and cultural traditions generated resistance that connected political opposition to cultural identity in ways that made Irish nationalism emotionally powerful as well as politically practical. The Irish literary revival of the 1880s and 1890s created cultural nationalism that complemented political movements while remaining formally separate from direct political action. Writers like W.B. Yeats, Lady Gregory, and John Millington Synge were creating distinctly Irish cultural expressions that challenged British cultural authority while remaining legally acceptable as artistic rather than political activity. The Parnell scandal of 1889–1891 revealed how personal morality could destroy political careers in ways that reflected Victorian sexual politics more than Irish political realities. When Parnell's relationship with Catherine O'Shea became public knowledge, British and Irish politicians who had worked with him for years suddenly discovered that his adultery made him unfit for political leadership. The scandal split Irish nationalism between supporters who considered Parnell's personal life irrelevant to his political effectiveness, and opponents who argued that moral scandal undermined Irish claims to deserve self-government. It was a debate about political leadership that revealed how Victorian moral standards could be weaponized to destroy inconvenient political opponents. But Parnell's fall also demonstrated the depth of Irish political development that could survive individual leadership changes. The Home Rule movement continued after Parnell's death, led by politicians who had learned from his example while developing their own strategies for advancing Irish interests within British political constraints. The generational trauma created by the famine continued shaping Irish politics throughout the Victorian period in ways that British politicians consistently underestimated. Irish families maintained memories of starvation, eviction, and emigration that made British promises about imperial benefits seem hollow, and British threats about the costs of independence seem less frightening than continued British rule. Irish-American success stories provided evidence that Irish people could achieve prosperity and political influence when freed from British economic and political constraints. The contrast between Irish poverty under British rule and Irish success in America suggested that British imperial authority was the primary obstacle to Irish advancement, rather than inherent Irish limitations. The economic relationship between Britain and Ireland remained essentially colonial throughout the Victorian period, with Ireland providing raw materials and agricultural products while importing manufactured goods from British factories. This economic structure created prosperity for British investors and consumers, while limiting Irish economic development in ways that perpetuated the social conditions that justified continued British political control. British investment in Irish infrastructure projects like railways and telegraphs improved transportation and communication, while also strengthening British administrative control over Irish territory. Every mile of railway track and telegraph wire made British rule more efficient, while also creating resources that Irish independence movements could eventually use for their own purposes. The Irish question was becoming a test case for whether democratic principles could be reconciled with imperial authority in ways that satisfied both imperial subjects and imperial powers. British politicians were discovering that concessions to Irish demands created precedents that could justify similar demands from other imperial territories, while rejection of Irish demands created resentments that made imperial authority increasingly expensive to maintain. By the 1890s, the Irish question had become a permanent source of political instability that challenged British assumptions about imperial unity, democratic representation, and cultural assimilation. Ireland was simultaneously too important to lose and too troublesome to govern, creating political problems that British politicians couldn't solve through traditional imperial strategies. The human cost of British-Irish relations was becoming impossible to ignore or rationalise through theories about imperial benefits and civilising missions. Irish emigration continued at rates that emptied entire regions, creating demographic changes that weakened Ireland economically, while strengthening Irish nationalism internationally through diaspora communities that remained committed to Irish independence. Ireland's position as Britain's closest and most developed imperial territory made it a laboratory for testing imperial policies that would later be applied in other colonial contexts. But Irish resistance was also creating models for anti-imperial organisation that could inspire independence movements throughout the British Empire. The question was no longer whether British rule in Ireland was beneficial or harmful, but whether it was sustainable in the long term given the political, economic and cultural forces that were making Irish independence seem both morally justified and practically achievable. The Irish question's intractable complexities were just one symptom of a broader imperial crisis that British authorities were beginning to recognise by the 1870s. The empire had grown so vast and complex that it was becoming impossible to govern effectively, prohibitively expensive to maintain, and increasingly dangerous to British interests rather than beneficial to them. What had begun as profitable commercial expansion was evolving into strategic overstretch that committed British military forces to conflicts across the globe while generating more problems than solutions. Afghanistan became the empire's recurring nightmare, a mountainous territory that seemed to consume British armies and imperial reputations with the regularity of a geological process. The First Afghan War, 1839–1842, had ended in military disaster so complete that only one British soldier survived to reach safety in India. But British strategists remained convinced that controlling Afghanistan was essential for protecting India from Russian expansion. The graveyard of empires was claiming Victorian victims with methodical efficiency, but each military defeat only convinced British policymakers that the next intervention would succeed where previous efforts had failed. It was imperial logic that confused military control with political stability, treating military occupation as a solution to political problems that military force had created in the first place. Picture the Second Afghan War beginning in 1878, launched because British officials were concerned about Russian influence in Kabul. British forces invaded Afghanistan to eliminate Russian influence by replacing the existing Afghan government with one more favourable to British interests. The immediate military campaign succeeded brilliantly. British troops occupied major Afghan cities, defeated Afghan armies, and installed a cooperative ruler who signed treaties guaranteeing British strategic objectives. But military victory created political problems that military force couldn't solve. The new Afghan government existed only through British military support, making it simultaneously powerful enough to oppress Afghan opposition and weak enough to require continued British protection. Afghan resistance shifted from conventional military opposition to guerrilla warfare that targeted British supply lines, isolated British garrisons, and made occupation so expensive that military success became strategic failure. The massacre of the British mission in Kabul in 1879 demonstrated how military occupation could transform political problems into moral outrages that demanded military responses. When Afghan resistance killed British diplomats and military advisors, British public opinion demanded revenge that required additional military campaigns to restore imperial prestige that previous military campaigns had supposedly secured. British forces reoccupied Kabul, defeated Afghan resistance armies, and imposed even harsher terms on Afghan authorities, creating cycles of occupation, resistance, retaliation, and further occupation that consumed British resources while generating Afghan opposition that made British strategic objectives increasingly impossible to achieve. But the cultural impact of Afghan wars on British consciousness was almost as important as their strategic consequences. British newspapers reported Afghan conflicts as heroic adventures where brave British soldiers brought civilization to savage territories, creating popular narratives that obscured the reality of military occupations that were failing to achieve their stated political objectives. The myth of imperial heroism required constant reinforcement through stories of individual British courage and Afghan barbarity that justified continued military intervention while explaining why those interventions weren't producing the promised results. Every British military defeat became evidence of enemy treachery rather than strategic miscalculation. Every tactical victory became proof that additional resources would produce strategic success. South Africa presented different but equally intractable imperial challenges, where British authorities found themselves managing conflicts between white settler populations and indigenous African societies, while also competing with other European powers for territorial control. The discovery of diamonds in the 1860s and gold in the 1880s transformed South Africa from a strategic way station to an economic prize that generated international competition and local conflicts. The Boer republics represented a unique imperial problem. White settler communities with European cultural backgrounds and military capabilities who nevertheless rejected British political authority and maintained independent governments that controlled valuable economic resources. They were simultaneously too European to be treated as colonial subjects and too independent to be incorporated into British imperial administration. British relations with Boer republics combined diplomatic negotiation with military pressure in ways that satisfied nobody while creating conditions for larger conflicts. British officials alternately recognized Boer independence and violated it, depending on immediate strategic considerations that changed faster than diplomatic agreements could be negotiated or implemented. The Zulu War of 1879 revealed how imperial expansion could create military conflicts that British authorities hadn't planned or wanted, driven by local British officials who made commitments that exceeded their authority, while pursuing objectives that served personal rather than imperial interests. Lord Chelmsford invaded Zulu land to eliminate a supposed threat to British settlers, launching military campaigns that British policymakers in London would never have authorised if they had understood the likely consequences. The Battle of Isandlwana became one of Britain's worst colonial defeats, where Zulu forces destroyed an entire British regiment, using traditional weapons and tactics that British military doctrine had dismissed as primitive and ineffective. Over 300 British and colonial troops were killed in a single engagement that demonstrated how military technology advantages could be neutralised by superior numbers, local knowledge, and tactical innovation. But British newspapers reported Zulu military success as savage barbarity rather than tactical competence, describing Zulu victories in language that emphasised British victimisation rather than Zulu military capabilities. The same imperial ideology that justified British conquest of indigenous territories made it impossible to acknowledge that indigenous resistance could be strategically rational and tactically sophisticated. The simultaneous Battle of Rorke's Drift, where a small British garrison successfully defended against Zulu attack, became the heroic narrative that British popular culture used to process military defeat. Individual British courage and determination could overcome overwhelming odds when defending civilization against savagery, even when larger strategic situations demonstrated that British imperial policies were creating the conflicts that required such defensive heroism. Sudan represented imperial expansion driven by moral rhetoric that concealed strategic objectives while generating military commitments that exceeded British capabilities. The Mahdi revolt against Egyptian authority created political chaos in territories that British officials considered essential for protecting trade routes to India, leading to military intervention disguised as humanitarian rescue missions. General Charles Gordon became the imperial martyr whose death in Khartoum provided moral justification for military campaigns that were actually motivated by strategic competition with other European powers for influence in northeastern Africa. Gordon's heroic last stand against Mahdist forces created popular narratives about imperial sacrifice that obscured the reality of imperial policies that had created the conditions requiring such sacrifice. The Gordon rescue mission that arrived too late to save Khartoum became a symbol of imperial tragedy that simultaneously honoured individual British heroism and criticised imperial administration for failing to support that heroism with adequate resources and planning. It was imperial mythology that celebrated imperial values while implicitly acknowledging imperial failures. But Sudan campaigns also demonstrated how imperial expansion could create military commitments that required indefinite occupation of territories that provided no obvious strategic or economic benefits. British forces found themselves responsible for governing vast territories with hostile populations, desert climates, and economic systems that couldn't support the military forces required to maintain British authority. Indian unrest during the 1870s and 1880s revealed how successful imperial policies could create the conditions for their own eventual failure by producing educated colonial subjects who could use British political philosophy to challenge British imperial authority. Indians who had studied in British universities were beginning to organise political movements that demanded the same democratic representation that British subjects enjoyed in Britain. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, represented educated Indian opinion that accepted British political principles while rejecting British imperial practices. Indian political leaders weren't challenging the idea of democratic government, but were demanding that democratic government be applied consistently rather than restricted to British subjects in Britain. But British authorities couldn't grant democratic representation to Indians without acknowledging that British rule in India was based on racial discrimination rather than civilizational superiority. If Indians were capable of democratic participation, British imperial authority in India became an arbitrary exercise of power rather than a beneficial civilizing mission. The economic drain of military campaigns was becoming impossible to ignore by the 1880s, as British taxpayers were funding simultaneous military operations in Afghanistan, South Africa, Sudan, and Burma, while maintaining garrison forces throughout the empire to prevent or suppress local resistance movements. Imperial expansion was consuming resources faster than imperial territories were generating revenues. Military technology was making colonial wars more expensive rather than more efficient. As modern artillery, rapid-fire weapons, and improved transportation systems required larger financial investments, while providing smaller strategic advantages, indigenous resistance movements were adapting to British military technology by developing guerrilla tactics that neutralized technological superiority through political strategies that British military doctrine couldn't counter. The cultural impact of imperial wars on British domestic politics was creating public expectations for military success that imperial realities couldn't satisfy. British voters who supported imperial expansion through newspaper accounts of heroic military adventures expected those adventures to produce clear victories and permanent solutions to imperial problems. But imperial conflicts were generating moral complexity that challenged simple narratives about British civilization, bringing order to savage territories. Reports of British military brutality, civilian casualties, and failed military campaigns were beginning to reach British audiences who had been told that imperial expansion was both morally justified and strategically beneficial. The professional military consequences were equally troubling, as colonial warfare was producing British officers who specialised in fighting indigenous opponents rather than European enemies. Colonial military experience was creating tactical doctrines and strategic assumptions that might be inappropriate for the major European wars that British military planning assumed would determine Britain's ultimate security. By the 1890s, British imperial policy was trapped in strategic contradictions that couldn't be resolved through traditional imperial methods. Imperial territories required military protection that was becoming prohibitively expensive, but abandoning imperial territories would eliminate the economic benefits that justified the military expenses. Imperial expansion was creating diplomatic complications with other European powers who were pursuing their own imperial objectives, leading to international tensions that threatened to transform colonial conflicts into European wars that could destroy the imperial system entirely. The empire that had seemed like the foundation of British greatness was beginning to look like a strategic liability that committed Britain to defending indefensible positions while generating more enemies than allies. Imperial success was creating the conditions for imperial failure, but British authorities couldn't acknowledge this reality without undermining the entire ideological foundation that justified British global dominance. While British military forces were struggling with intractable imperial conflicts across 3 continents, Victoria herself remained largely insulated from the brutal realities of empire, receiving sanitized reports that emphasized British achievements while minimizing colonial costs. By the mid-1890s, she had become a symbolic figure whose very longevity suggested imperial permanence and divine approval, even as the empire she represented was becoming increasingly difficult to govern and expensive to maintain. The Diamond Jubilee of 1897 represented the high-water mark of imperial spectacle, a celebration so elaborate and comprehensive that it required representatives from every corner of the British Empire to travel to London for parades that would demonstrate imperial unity to audiences both domestic and international. It was pageantry designed to project power and confidence, while concealing the strategic anxieties and administrative failures that were making imperial governance increasingly problematic. 60 years on the throne was unprecedented in British history. No previous monarch had ruled long enough to celebrate a Diamond Jubilee, and Victoria's longevity had become a symbol of British imperial permanence that suggested divine blessing for British global dominance. She had outlived most of her contemporaries, presided over transformations that made her early reign seem like ancient history, and witnessed the birth of technologies that were reshaping human civilization. Picture London in June 1897, transformed into an imperial stage set where every street decoration, every ceremonial detail, and every participating group was carefully orchestrated to demonstrate the scope and diversity of British imperial authority. Colonial representatives wearing traditional costumes marched alongside British military units in uniforms that had been designed for maximum visual impact rather than practical military utility. The procession itself was a carefully choreographed display of imperial hierarchy, with representatives arranged according to their territory's importance in British imperial calculations. Indian princes in elaborate ceremonial dress rode on decorated elephants. Canadian and Australian representatives demonstrated the success of white settler colonies. African and Caribbean representatives provided exotic visual interest while remaining carefully subordinate to European colonial administrators. Victoria herself, now 78 years old and unable to walk long distances, rode in an open carriage that allowed crowds to see the empress whose reign had spanned the entire development of modern industrial civilization. She was simultaneously the most powerful woman in the world and an elderly grandmother whose personal authority depended on constitutional arrangements that limited her actual political power. The technological marvels on display during the Diamond Jubilee demonstrated how rapidly human capabilities had expanded during Victoria's reign. Telegraph lines connected London instantly with territories across 6 continents, allowing real-time communication that made global imperial administration theoretically possible for the first time in human history. Electric lighting illuminated evening celebrations with brightness that would have seemed miraculous to people who remembered when gas lighting was revolutionary technology. Photography captured permanent records of imperial spectacle that could be reproduced in newspapers across the empire, creating shared visual experiences that connected colonial subjects with imperial celebrations even when they couldn't participate directly. It was mass media technology serving imperial propaganda purposes, creating emotional connections between distant territories and imperial ceremonies. But the Diamond Jubilee also revealed the growing complexity of imperial relationships that were becoming impossible to manage through traditional imperial methods. Colonial representatives weren't just exotic decoration for British imperial celebrations. They were political leaders who governed territories with their own interests, resources, and strategic objectives that didn't always align with British imperial priorities. The Indian princes who participated in Diamond Jubilee ceremonies commanded armies, controlled vast territories, and possessed political authority that made them allies rather than subjects in British imperial administration. Their participation in imperial celebrations represented negotiated political relationships rather than simple imperial domination. Canadian and Australian representatives were becoming increasingly independent political actors who participated in imperial ceremonies while developing their own foreign policies, military capabilities, and economic relationships that could conflict with British imperial interests. They were simultaneously imperial territories and emerging nations that might eventually pursue complete independence. The African and Caribbean representatives demonstrated the diversity of imperial relationships that range from direct colonial administration to protectorate agreements to trading partnerships that involved minimal British political authority. Imperial unity was actually imperial diversity that was becoming increasingly difficult to coordinate through centralised British decision-making. Victoria, as grandmother of Europe, added another layer of complexity to British imperial relationships, as her children and grandchildren had married into European royal families that were developing their own imperial ambitions and strategic objectives. Family relationships that were supposed to strengthen British diplomatic influence were actually creating competing loyalties and conflicting interests. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was Victoria's grandson, but German imperial expansion was challenging British imperial interests in ways that made family affection irrelevant to strategic calculation. Nicholas II of Russia was married to Victoria's granddaughter, but Russian imperial expansion threatened British interests in Afghanistan, Persia, and the Ottoman Empire regardless of royal family connections. The diplomatic complications created by royal family relationships were becoming strategic liabilities rather than diplomatic assets, as family disputes could escalate into international crises, while family loyalties could prevent clear strategic thinking about European balance of power issues. Telegraph technology that connected the empire instantaneously was also making imperial administration more complex rather than more efficient. Colonial governors could now communicate with London daily rather than monthly, but this constant communication created opportunities for micromanagement from London that undermined local administrative authority while generating bureaucratic conflicts over decision-making responsibility. The same technology that made global empire theoretically manageable was actually revealing how unmanageable global empire had become in practice. Instant communication created expectations for immediate responses to complex problems that required local knowledge and cultural understanding that London administrators couldn't possess. The visual splendour of Diamond Jubilee celebrations concealed growing financial strains that were making imperial administration increasingly expensive relative to imperial benefits. The military forces required to maintain order in Afghanistan, Sudan, South Africa and Burma were consuming resources faster than those territories were generating revenues for British taxpayers. Imperial spectacle was becoming a substitute for imperial effectiveness, with ceremonial displays of imperial unity compensating for strategic realities that demonstrated imperial fragmentation. The more elaborate the imperial celebrations became, the more they revealed anxieties about imperial sustainability that couldn't be resolved through military force or administrative reform. The global perspective on British Empire during the Diamond Jubilee revealed how differently imperial relationships looked from colonial territories than they appeared from London. Colonial subjects who participated in imperial celebrations were often demonstrating their own political development rather than their subordination to British authority. Indian participation in Diamond Jubilee ceremonies showcased Indian cultural achievements, economic development, and political sophistication that supported arguments for Indian self-government, rather than justifying continued British imperial control. The more impressive Indian contributions to imperial celebrations became, the more they challenged British claims about Indian incapacity for democratic self-government. Canadian and Australian participation demonstrated the success of responsible government policies that had granted substantial political autonomy to white settler territories, creating precedents that other colonial territories could cite in support of their own demands for political independence. Even African and Caribbean participation revealed cultural sophistication and political organization that contradicted imperial propaganda about savage territories requiring civilizing missions. Colonial subjects who could organize impressive ceremonial contributions to imperial celebrations were obviously capable of organizing their own political institutions. Time's passage was becoming visible in ways that challenged assumptions about imperial permanence and British global dominance. Victoria had ruled longer than most empires had lasted in human history, but her advanced age was a reminder that even successful political arrangements were temporary rather than permanent. The technologies that had revolutionized human civilization during Victoria's reign were also creating capabilities that could eventually challenge British imperial supremacy. Telegraph communications that connected the British Empire could also connect resistance movements across imperial territories. Railway networks that facilitated British imperial administration could also facilitate coordinated opposition to British imperial authority. Industrial technologies that had given Britain decisive advantages over pre-industrial societies were being adopted by other European powers and eventually by colonial subjects themselves, eliminating the technological superiority that had made British imperial expansion possible in the first place. The educational policies that had created colonial administrators and collaborators were also creating colonial leaders who could organize independence movements using political and organizational skills learned through British educational institutions. Imperial success was creating the human resources necessary for imperial dissolution. By 1897, the Diamond Jubilee was simultaneously celebrating 60 years of unprecedented imperial success and marking the beginning of imperial decline that would accelerate over the following decades. Victoria was ruling over the largest empire in human history at the moment when that empire was becoming strategically unsustainable and politically illegitimate. The old queen ruling a transformed world represented both the achievements and limitations of British imperial civilization. She had presided over technological, economic and social changes that had revolutionized human existence, while maintaining political and cultural institutions that were becoming inadequate for managing the complexity that progress had created. The Diamond Jubilee marked the end of Victorian certainty about progress, empire and British global mission, even as it celebrated the achievements that had created that certainty in the first place. It was imperial theatre performed at the moment when the audience was beginning to question whether the imperial performance was worth the human and financial cost required to maintain it. The magnificent spectacle of the Diamond Jubilee had barely faded from memory when a different kind of atmosphere began settling over British society, a sense of endings and beginnings, of certainties dissolving and new possibilities emerging that nobody quite knew how to interpret. The 1890s brought a peculiar combination of technological marvels and cultural rebellion that made the decade feel like the end of one world and the beginning of another, even as Victoria continued ruling from her black-draped palaces, like a living monument to an age that was already becoming history. Fin de siècle, the end of the century, had become more than a calendar designation. It was a cultural condition that infected everything from art galleries to factory floors, creating an atmosphere of restless anticipation that combined excitement about technological possibilities with anxiety about social changes that seemed to be accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control or understand. New technologies were appearing so rapidly that each innovation made previous marvels look primitive by comparison. The automobile was beginning to appear on British roads, creating mechanical transportation that didn't depend on horses, railways, or waterways. Early motorcar owners were treated like curiosities, driving vehicles that moved at walking speed while generating noise, smoke, and mechanical failures that made horses look reliable by comparison. But even primitive automobiles represented a fundamental challenge to Victorian assumptions about transportation, social mobility, and the relationship between technology and human freedom. If individuals could own mechanical transportation that didn't require vast infrastructure investments like railways, what happened to the economic and political systems that controlled access to transportation networks? Cinema was creating entertainment experiences that seemed to capture reality itself, projecting moving images that allowed audiences to witness events happening in distant locations, or fictional stories that looked like actual experiences. The first film showings drew crowds who weren't sure whether they were seeing mechanical tricks or actual magic, creating entertainment that challenged the distinction between reality and illusion. Wireless telegraphy was eliminating the final constraints on human communication by making it possible to send messages without physical connections between sender and receiver. Guglielmo Marconi's experiments with radio transmission suggested that human voices could eventually travel through the air across unlimited distances, creating communication possibilities that made even telegraph networks seem primitive and limited. Each technological innovation created social possibilities that challenged existing institutions while generating anxieties about changes that could transform human civilization in ways that nobody could predict or control. If technology could eliminate traditional constraints on transportation, communication, and entertainment, what other constraints might disappear, and what kind of society would emerge when traditional limitations were removed? The decadent movement in arts and literature was simultaneously celebrating and criticizing the technological and social changes that were transforming Victorian civilization. Oscar Wilde and his contemporaries were creating aesthetic philosophy that treated beauty as more important than moral utility, artistic expression as more valuable than social responsibility, and individual fulfillment as more significant than social conformity. Wilde's wit and sophistication represented intellectual rebellion disguised as entertainment, using humour and aesthetic theory to challenge Victorian moral certainties while maintaining enough social respectability to avoid direct confrontation with authority. His plays drew audiences who laughed at jokes that subtly undermined the social conventions they publicly supported, but Wilde's eventual imprisonment for gross indecency revealed how quickly aesthetic rebellion could become moral scandal when it challenged too directly the sexual conventions that maintained Victorian social order. His trial and conviction demonstrated that Victorian society would tolerate artistic criticism of social institutions, but not personal behaviour that violated fundamental assumptions about proper masculine conduct. The aesthetic movement that Wilde represented was part of broader cultural shifts that were challenging Victorian assumptions about the relationship between art, morality, and social responsibility. Art Nouveau was creating visual styles that emphasized organic forms and flowing lines, rather than the geometric precision and moral symbolism that had characterized earlier Victorian design. Symbolism in literature was exploring psychological and spiritual themes through indirect suggestion rather than the direct moral instruction that had characterized mid-Victorian writing. Writers like W.B. Yeats and Arthur Symons were creating poetry that treated language as musical sound rather than moral communication, artistic expression, as personal exploration rather than social education. The psychological novel was emerging as a literary form that explored individual consciousness and emotional experience rather than social relationships and moral development. Writers were beginning to investigate the unconscious motivations and irrational desires that influenced human behaviour, challenging Victorian assumptions about rational self-control and moral choice. The new woman was becoming a social reality rather than just a literary ideal, as increasing numbers of middle-class women were pursuing higher education, professional careers, and political activism that challenged traditional gender roles while remaining within the bounds of social respectability. These women weren't rejecting Victorian ideals of feminine virtue, but they were expanding those ideals to include intellectual achievement and public service. Professional women were demonstrating that female capabilities extended far beyond domestic management and child-rearing, but they were doing so in ways that often required personal sacrifices that made their achievements seem exceptional rather than normal. The choice between marriage and career remained essentially absolute for most women, creating life decisions that men rarely faced. The bicycle became an unexpected symbol of women's liberation, providing independent transportation that allowed women to travel without male escort, while engaging in physical activity that challenged assumptions about female physical capabilities and appropriate feminine behaviour. Bicycle riding required practical clothing that eliminated some of the restrictive elements of Victorian female fashion, while creating new social opportunities for unchaperoned interaction between men and women. Socialist movements were gaining political influence by organising working-class voters who were beginning to understand that their economic interests conflicted fundamentally with the interests of employers and property owners. The Independent Labour Party, founded in 1893, represented political organisation that challenged the assumption that working-class voters would automatically support either conservative or liberal candidates who represented middle-class and upper-class interests. Trade union membership was expanding among both skilled and unskilled workers who were developing collective bargaining strategies that could force employers to improve wages and working conditions through economic pressure rather than political appeals to employer benevolence. Strike activity was becoming more frequent and better organised, creating industrial conflicts that challenged assumptions about natural harmony between employer and worker interests. The 8-hour workday movement was gaining momentum by connecting individual workplace grievances to broader political demands for legislation that would regulate working conditions through government authority rather than market forces. It represented political challenges to laissez-faire economic philosophy that had justified minimal government interference with employment relationships. Imperial competition with Germany was intensifying as German industrial production began approaching British levels, while German military capabilities were developing technologies and strategies that could challenge British naval supremacy. The naval arms race was forcing Britain to invest enormous resources in maintaining technological advantages that were becoming increasingly expensive and potentially temporary. German economic competition was challenging British commercial dominance in markets throughout Europe and beyond, demonstrating that British industrial supremacy was not permanent and that other nations could develop competitive capabilities through systematic investment in education, technology, and industrial infrastructure. The diplomatic complications created by competing imperial ambitions were generating international tensions that threatened to transform colonial conflicts into European wars that could destroy the entire system of imperial relationships that had sustained British prosperity throughout the Victorian period. Cultural anxiety about imperial competition was beginning to appear in literature, journalism, and political discourse that warned about foreign threats to British institutions, British economic interests, and British cultural values. Invasion literature became a popular genre that depicted fictional foreign conquests of Britain, creating entertainment that expressed genuine fears about British vulnerability. Generational change was becoming visible in ways that revealed how rapidly Victorian society was evolving beyond the institutions and assumptions that had shaped early Victorian consciousness. Young adults coming of age in the 1890s had grown up with electric lighting, telephone communications, and transportation networks that made their world fundamentally different from the world their parents remembered. The contrast between Victoria's world and the world that Edward VII would inherit was becoming stark enough that royal succession would represent not just political change, but cultural transformation. Edward represented social attitudes and lifestyle choices that were much more compatible with fin de siècle cultural developments than Victoria's continued mourning for Alba and resistance to social change. Victoria's withdrawal from public life was becoming a more serious political problem, as the monarchy needed to represent a society that was changing faster than royal institutions could adapt. Edward's social connections, international travel, and modern interests made him a more appropriate representative for a society that was becoming increasingly cosmopolitan and culturally diverse. Premonitions of 20th century violence were beginning to appear in technological developments, and international tensions that suggested future conflicts would be fought with weapons and strategies that could produce casualties on scales that would make 19th century wars look like limited regional conflicts. Modern artillery was becoming powerful enough to destroy cities from distances that would make civilian populations direct targets, rather than incidental casualties. Industrial production capabilities were creating potential for manufacturing weapons in quantities that could sustain warfare for years rather than months. International alliance systems were creating diplomatic relationships that could transform local conflicts into global wars involving multiple great powers with imperial territories across every continent. A crisis anywhere in the world could theoretically escalate into warfare that would involve European nations fighting in Africa, Asia, and the Americas simultaneously. The technologies that had created Victorian prosperity and imperial dominance were being adapted for military purposes that could make future wars more destructive than any previous human conflicts. Railway networks that moved commercial goods could also move armies and military supplies with unprecedented speed and efficiency. Industrial facilities that produced civilian goods could be converted to weapons production that could sustain prolonged military campaigns. By 1900, the fin de siècle atmosphere was creating cultural conditions that combined optimism about technological possibilities with pessimism about social and political developments that seemed to be moving beyond human control. The century that had begun with confidence about progress, civilization, and human improvement was ending with questions about whether human institutions could manage the power that technological development had created. The new century arrived while Victoria was still alive, still ruling, still representing continuity with a world that was rapidly disappearing around her. But even her legendary stamina couldn't resist the biological realities that were finally claiming the woman who had somehow managed to outlive most of her subjects, all of her original ministers, and nearly every assumption that had defined British civilization when she first ascended the throne 64 years earlier. Victoria's final illness began in December 1900 with symptoms that would have been unremarkable in anyone else, but seemed ominous in an 81-year-old monarch whose death would mark not just the end of a life, but the conclusion of an entire era. She had been gradually weakening for months, losing the mental sharpness and physical energy that had sustained her through decades of constitutional crises, imperial expansion, and personal tragedies that would have destroyed lesser mortals. The irony was profound. Victoria was dying just as the 20th century was beginning, as if her body had somehow synchronized with the calendar to ensure that her death would coincide with the historical transition she had come to symbolize. She had bridged the gap between the pre-industrial world and the technological age, between aristocratic government and democratic politics, between local authority and global empire. Picture the scene at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight in January 1901, where family members were gathering with the kind of anxious attention that surrounds deathbeds, but also with the political awareness that they were witnessing a moment that would reshape British and world history. Kaiser Wilhelm II, despite growing tensions between Germany and Britain, travelled to England to be present at his grandmother's deathbed, creating a surreal family scene where European power politics temporarily gave way to human grief. The medical attention Victoria received during her final illness demonstrated both the advances and limitations of Victorian medicine. She had access to the best physicians available, the most advanced treatments known to medical science, and the kind of intensive care that was available only to the wealthy. But even royal status couldn't overcome the fundamental biological processes that end human life, regardless of political importance or historical significance. Victoria died on January 22, 1901, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, who represented the European royal families that would soon be at war with each other in conflicts that would destroy the imperial world she had created. Her final words, according to family accounts, were Bertie, calling for her eldest son, who would become Edward VII and inherit responsibilities for managing an empire that was already becoming ungovernable. The immediate aftermath of Victoria's death revealed how thoroughly she had become identified with British national identity and imperial authority. People throughout the empire learned of her death through telegraph communications that could transmit news faster than previous generations could have imagined, creating simultaneous mourning across continents and time zones. The funeral preparations became an exercise in imperial theatre that rivaled the Diamond Jubilee in scope and complexity, with representatives from every territory in the British Empire participating in ceremonies designed to demonstrate continuity of imperial authority, even as the monarch who had embodied that authority was being buried. It was political stagecraft designed to suggest that imperial institutions were stronger than any individual, even the individual who had defined those institutions for over 6 decades. London transformed into a city of mourning where black decorations covered buildings, businesses closed out of respect, and crowds gathered to witness the funeral procession that would mark the end of the Victorian age and the beginning of whatever would come next. The scale of public grief was unprecedented, suggesting that Victoria's death was being experienced as personal loss by people who had never met her, but who had lived their entire lives under her reign. Foreign representatives who attended Victoria's funeral were witnessing not just the burial of a monarch, but the conclusion of a historical period that had defined the terms of international relations, economic development, and cultural progress for most of the 19th century. The world that would emerge after Victoria's death would operate according to different rules and different assumptions about power, progress, and human possibility. Edward VII's accession represented generational change that went far beyond simple royal succession. At 59, he was inheriting the throne after decades of preparation that had been complicated by his mother's longevity and her resistance to sharing royal authority with the heir apparent, who represented social attitudes and cultural interests that often conflicted with Victorian moral standards. Edward's personality, lifestyle, and political instincts were much more compatible with 20th century realities than Victoria's commitment to mid-Victorian moral certainties and resistance to social change. He had travelled extensively, maintained international friendships, and demonstrated comfort with social and cultural developments that Victoria had found troubling or incomprehensible. The contrast between Victoria's mourning for Albert and Edward's embrace of social life represented different approaches to royal authority and public representation that would shape how the monarchy adapted to democratic politics and changing social expectations. Edward understood that royal influence in the 20th century would depend on public popularity rather than constitutional authority, social connections rather than political power. What died with Victoria was more than just an individual monarch. It was an entire complex of assumptions about progress, empire, and British global mission that had sustained Victorian confidence throughout the 19th century. Victorian certainty about British superiority, imperial mission, and technological progress had been gradually undermined by imperial conflicts, international competition, and social changes that challenged fundamental Victorian beliefs about civilization and human nature. The empire Victoria left behind was simultaneously larger and more fragile than the territories she had inherited in 1837. British authority extended across more territory and governed more people than any previous empire, But that authority was increasingly challenged by colonial subjects who had learned to use British political principles against British imperial practices. Victorian social institutions were similarly contradictory, more democratic and more restrictive than early Victorian society, offering greater opportunities for individual achievement while maintaining class distinctions and gender restrictions that limited those opportunities to privileged minorities. Victorian progress had created both greater freedom and more sophisticated forms of social control. The technological achievements of Victoria's reign had revolutionized human capabilities while creating new forms of vulnerability that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Telegraph communications that connected global empire also connected resistance movements. Railway networks that facilitated imperial administration also facilitated organized opposition. Industrial production that created unprecedented wealth also created unprecedented capacity for destruction. Victoria's legacy was therefore deeply ambiguous. Enormous achievements that contained the seeds of their own eventual destruction, progress that created new problems while solving old ones, institutions that were simultaneously more advanced and more unstable than anything previous human societies had created. The symbolic moment of Victoria's death coinciding with the century's end created opportunities for historical reflection that revealed how dramatically human civilization had changed during her reign. The world of 1901 was recognizably modern, in ways that the world of 1837 had not been, with technologies, institutions and social relationships that would remain essentially familiar to 21st century observers. But the world of 1901 was also on the verge of changes that would make Victorian achievements seem quaint, and Victorian problems seem simple by comparison. The technologies that had created Victorian prosperity would soon create industrial warfare of unprecedented destructiveness. The imperial competition that had driven Victorian expansion would soon produce global conflicts that would destroy the European political system that had made imperial expansion possible. The Edwardian era that began with Edward VII's accession would serve as a bridge between Victorian certainties and 20th century uncertainties, preserving some Victorian institutions while adapting others to modern conditions that Victoria could never have anticipated. It would be a period of transition that combined nostalgia for Victorian achievements with recognition that Victorian methods were inadequate for modern challenges. Forward-looking observers in 1901 could see that the new century would require different approaches to the problems Victoria's reign had created. Imperial governance, industrial society, democratic politics, and international relations that were becoming too complex for traditional methods of management and control. The age that ended with Victoria's death had been defined by confidence in human progress, British imperial mission, and technological solutions to social problems. The age that began with Edward VII's accession would be defined by questions about whether human institutions could manage the power that progress had created, whether imperial systems could survive democratic pressures, and whether technological capabilities could be controlled by political wisdom. As Victoria's funeral cortege wound through London streets lined with mourning crowds, it was carrying more than a royal corpse to its final resting place. It was carrying the dreams, assumptions, and certainties of an age that had transformed human civilization while creating the conditions for its own eventual supersession by forces it had unleashed but could not ultimately control. The Victorian age was over, but its legacy would shape everything that followed, for better and for worse. As the 20th century began the work of dealing with the consequences of Victorian achievement and the problems Victorian progress had created but could not solve. And so we reach the end of our journey through Victoria's 64 years, watching as the funeral cortege disappears into history and the gaslight era gives way to the electric age that would follow. But before you drift towards sleep, take a moment to consider how thoroughly Victorian that modern world you inhabit actually remains. How many of the innovations we've explored tonight are still shaping the way you live, work, and understand yourself in the 21st century? The sewage system that Joseph Bazalgette built to save London from cholera still carries waste beneath the streets where you might walk tomorrow. The railway networks that transformed Victorian transportation still connect cities across continents, though the steam engines have given way to electric trains that travel at speeds those Victorian engineers could barely imagine. The telegraph system that first connected Victoria's global empire evolved into the internet cables that carry these words to your screen right now. But the Victorian legacy runs much deeper than infrastructure and technology. The moral questions that kept Victorian consciences awake at night are the same questions that dominate our political debates and personal anxieties today. How do we balance individual freedom with social responsibility? How do we manage the power that technological progress creates? How do we address the inequality that accompanies economic development? How do we maintain democratic institutions while governing increasingly complex societies? Victoria's subjects wondered whether industrial progress was worth the human cost, whether global empire could be morally justified, whether traditional social structures could adapt to rapid change. We wonder whether artificial intelligence will eliminate human employment, whether global capitalism can be environmentally sustainable, whether democratic institutions can manage the complexity that technological development has created. The Victorians invented the modern city, the modern factory, the modern office, and the modern middle-class family. They created the first global economy, the first mass media, the first international scientific community. They developed modern medicine, modern education, and modern social welfare systems. They were the first society to grapple seriously with the consequences of rapid technological change, industrial production, and global communication networks. Most importantly, they created the idea that human societies could be consciously improved through rational analysis, technological innovation, and political reform. Victorian confidence in progress may seem naive from our perspective, but their belief that human intelligence and effort could solve social problems remains the foundation of every reform movement, every scientific research program, every technological startup that promises to make the world better. Even Victorian contradictions remain remarkably contemporary. They struggled with the gap between public virtue and private behaviour, between democratic ideals and economic inequality, between technological capability and moral wisdom. They lived in a society where unprecedented prosperity coexisted with devastating poverty, where scientific rationality competed with religious faith, where global connectivity increased rather than decreased cultural conflicts. The Victorian age was the laboratory where the modern world was born, where humans first learned to harness steam power, electric energy, and global communication networks, where democratic politics first had to manage industrial economies and urban populations, where individual rights first came into serious conflict with traditional authorities and social expectations. Victoria's world created our world, with all its possibilities and all its problems, the technologies that power your daily life, the institutions that govern your society, the moral frameworks that guide your personal decisions. All of these emerged from the gaslit streets and smoke-filled factories of Victorian Britain, refined through 64 years of unprecedented change and adaptation. As you drift towards sleep, remember that you've walked through the birth of modernity itself, witnessed the emergence of the first recognizably modern society, and observed how our ancestors grappled with versions of the same challenges that keep us awake at night. The Victorian lamplight is dimming now, the gaslit streets are growing quiet, and the age of certainties is giving way to the age of questions that we're still learning to ask. Rest well in the knowledge that human resilience, ingenuity, and hope have survived greater transformations than any we face today, and that the Victorians who created our modern world did so while navigating changes every bit as dramatic and uncertain as those that lie ahead of us. The Victorian age is ending, the 20th century is beginning, and you can finally let yourself slip into the sleep that connects all human experience across the centuries we've travelled together tonight.